Welcome to Partners in Policymaking in Alabama. Any opportunity for citizens to learn more about our legal process is a great one. Partners in Policymaking focuses on helping individuals with developmental disabilities and their supporters to build positive relationships with policymakers. This allows them to become partners in the policymaking process to change the system that supports, but may at times create limits on the lives of those with developmental disabilities. I'd like to thank all who are here to demonstrate their support for this project, including legislators, state agency leaders, people members, and graduates. And I'd like to especially thank the Alabama Developmental Disabilities Network partners for spearheading this project. Thank you for attending, and I cannot wait to see what great things you will do to improve our state for individuals with developmental disabilities. May God continue to bless each of you and the great state of Alabama.
Just to give a quick bio for our speakers, Jess Hissam is a doctor of physical therapy who graduated from Stanford University with a Bachelor of Science in Exercise Science and Psychology, and continued her formal education at UAB and earned her degree as a doctor of physical therapy. She, quote, retired from being a pelvic health physical therapist and has turned into a full-time deaf advocate, mentor, and is the current executive director for Center for Advancement of Next Gen Deaf. Her projects and activities include that her passion for others was also a non-attorney special education advocate and a deaf advisor on Alabama Hearing Detection and Intervention, EHDI for short, the working task group for that. She serves as a council member for the Alabama Council on Developmental Disabilities and is a proud 2022, sorry guys, I can't talk today. She's a proud 2022-23 Partners in Policymaking Alabama graduate. Jess resides in Huntsville with her husband, Chris, and their Chocolate Lab whiskey. I like that name. So that's Jess, and I'll go ahead and do Dan so you know who all's providing input here. Dan Kessler holds a master's degree in social work from Florida State University and a bachelor's degree from Purdue University. He's been involved in the independent living movement for 38 years, including 32 years employed as executive director at Disability Rights and Resources in Birmingham. He retired at the end of 2021. Following retirement, Dan served as interim executive director of the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, a national membership organization. Dan has previously served on numerous state boards and committees. He was president of the National Council of Independent Living and held several other positions prior to becoming president, like vice president, region rep chair, region 4 rep, at-large board member, and chair of the housing subcommittee. He is also a former member of the Alabama State Independent Living Council. Dan resides in Birmingham with his wife, Gail. They have been married 50 years. Wow. 49. 49. Close to 50 years. So, well, welcome to our speakers. Thank you. All right.
All right, so I am Jess. That's what I like to go by, and I'm gonna let you guys know I talk a little fast. So if I start talking too fast because I get excited easily, just tell me to slow down. It's really okay and everything. So I'm going to be primarily speaking today for history of disabilities, and Daniel is going to interject here and there with some additional information, but we're gonna get started. I don't know how much of you guys know about history of disabilities in general. Some for you guys, you may know a bit just from your own advocacy work and the work that you do. And for others, this is their first time. Y'all are watching Crip Camp tonight, which will be great. And there will be parts of that you may hear today and tomorrow both. So next slide, please. All right, so this is what it's gonna look like in terms of disability history for us. We're gonna start all the way back, ancient times, and we're gonna go all the way to present. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea, if you want to know what TW stands for, it's trigger warning, because eugenics, especially in disability history, is very triggering. I will try to lighten up as best as possible. but it is triggering. And I also include intentionally because you cannot talk about disability rights without civil rights, because without the people who were part of civil rights, we would not exist with disability rights either, and we're very thankful for that. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and then these is what Linda was saying about tomorrow's presentations. Next slide, please. Okay, so before I get started, we know that we're in a very hostile political climate, and I'm not talking about like what is superior, but we have to think about history. There's been a lot of people trying to take away history. There's been a lot of opinions about history, and it gets to the point where I find that it has caused a lot of tension in a way that we have not seen and witnessed before. So this quote really resonated with me. Colleen Wick is the executive director of the Minnesota Council of Developmental Disabilities, I believe still, but she presented at PIPA 2 years ago. I graduated from the last cohort, if you want to know, but I had the honor of being able to watch her presentation to prepare for this one. And she quoted this from Dr. Black. And I absolutely resonate with this quote because the reality is most of our histories are incomplete. And I always like to warn people, history will bias. If you want a certain outcome, you're going to bias that outcome. Same thing with research. We see that all the time too. So I like to acknowledge with disability history, there's a lot that gets recorded later, but there's also very little recorded. Just same thing with civil rights movement. There's been a lot of people have been forgotten that should be remembered. Next slide, please. All right, I hope this worked. It did not. This was basically an app if you want to type in your questions to me, and instead we'll just do the raising hand microphone question. So next slide, please. And go again. Next slide, please. Oh, we're here. Okay. So theory of mind, I like to talk about this before I present because when you think about history and everything, we have to come with an openness in each other. We may not agree with parts of history because it makes us uncomfortable. So that's where you have to really acknowledge your state of theory of mind in order to be able to expand and to be able to be willing to learn. Because ultimately at the heart of theory of mind, it enables us to understand what other people have different beliefs and ways of thinking. And that's something you're going to see as we discuss history as well. So I like to talk a little bit about theory of mind. Next slide, please. All right, so the reality of disability history. As I said, a little bit is documented, but we also have to be mindful of who wrote the history. It's painful and triggering. And it's full of ableism, but both internal and external. I am deaf. I culturally identify as deaf. I also culturify as big D and little d because I'm oral deaf, but a lot of people don't consider me deaf enough. So I have wrestled with a lot of internalized ableism most of my life and external ableism, both of labels and different stuff. And we'll talk some about the labels in terms of self-advocacy history tomorrow, because that's really interesting. But next slide, please. But there is hope with disability history. There is documented and there's records of compassion, especially the Black Panther movement, which a lot of people don't realize, and the self-advocacy movement. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And there are advocates for us and with us. And I believe it all the time, nothing about us without us all. And it's really important to remember the context of the times when discussing what happened then to understand what's going on today. Next slide, please. All right. Some people know the definition of ableism, other people don't. So I have put it up here if this is the first time. I feel like most people have heard the definition of ableism because social media. We see it everywhere now. There's been a huge surge of disabled advocates, I would say even more than ever, thanks to social media and the connections and everything. So this definition resonated with me on the definition of ableism because it does go back and we'll discuss it, but you can see that the word ableism is actually very driven by the medical model. So we'll talk about that when we get to that. Next slide, please. All right, ancient times. Next slide, please. All right, so what's fascinating to me as I did some reading and research going back just to where it all started, the respect for disabilities was actually where we started. People have respect for people who were disabled. In the very beginning with Egyptian. That's the first recorded record we have of history of all history of anybody who's disabled. And just so you know, I switched between the word disabled people and people with disabilities. I know people like to identify differently, and I promise it's not intent to offend or hurt someone. But if you feel like you don't like the way I state things, just let me know. I'm cool with that. All right, so the first reference of disabilities was the therapeutic papyrus of Thebes. which is 1522 BC, so before Christ, if you would want to know history. And it was the first reference to intellectual disabilities. And based on that, there was a philosopher, and this is the name, Median, oh, no, Mo, yeah. And he was a philosopher for the Egyptian culture in the New Kingdom, which is considered around the time they built the pyramids and stuff, if you want to know. And he believed that you should treat with compassion for people with disabilities. And it was an emphasis on respect, which is actually fascinating to think about, that movement disability history started with positiveness, because, next slide. Disability was perceived as a divine attribute granted to the humans by the gods. And it was prevalent, though recent anthropology studies are debunking it and going back on their word. But again, we have to remember who wrote history. It was believed for a while that King Tut had a club foot, and he also had connective tissue disorders. So hence, a lot of people believe that he was blessed by the gods because he looked different than other people did. So, and if you look at Egyptian art especially, you see a lot of differences. You don't see just people. You see people with cats, you see people with dogs. So it makes sense to me when you look at the cultural perspective and everything that Egyptians liked the differences. Next slide, please. All right. And then things kind of disappear. We have the Greek and the Roman Empire who overtook the Egyptians ultimately. So we're going to start with the Greek culture first. So we went from you treat people with respect, you care for them, you take care of them, to what is the perfect body. And it was a very narrow perspective. So I'm going to highlight a little bit, but I do feel, okay, idea of perfection. So the ideal perfection in the Greek was, in order to achieve like a higher state in life, a higher status in life, you had like to have the perfect body, the perfect size, the perfect mindset, and it was almost incorporated into soul and different stuff as well. And you saw that prevalent even with Greek mythology and Roman literature both. But what people don't realize is Aristotle, who was one of the most fascinating philosophers of the time with his idea of theory in mind, he was actually very anti-disabilities. He believed that as to the exposure and rearing of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live, because he believed in perfection. And so that's something we have to acknowledge as well, that even after the Egyptian pyramid and everything, and starting with the Greek culture, even one of the most famous philosophers stated and believed that any child that was deformed should be killed and not alive. So, and around this time is when the word idios, which is Latin for idiot, which can be also translated to private person, somewhat ignorant, was also developed in the Greek culture in Latin. And of course, we see this term lots of ways today, idiot. And in the 1900s, idiot was used to define someone who had IQ of 0 to 25. So fascinating. It started all the way back in Greek culture, which is back before Christ and AD both. And we're still seeing some of the same terms today. Next slide, please. And then Roman culture, so people forget the Greeks were there first, and then the Romans took over them with the Roman Empire and everything. So they took a lot of the Greek culture and basically emerged into their own culture with a military attitude and everything. They were very military action driven. The Greeks were more about science, art. The Romans were about conquering. So, but they reinforced the idea of perfectionism, and it was common practice in the Roman Empire that children with disabilities and adults with disabilities a little different, but we'll discuss that. But if you had a child with a disability, it was encouraged that death, mutation, because if you cut off a limb of your child, they could be a beggar for you and look more deformed, so they were likely to get more money. And abandonment of children. They even had laws, and then we'll discuss this, the 12 tables. But if you injured an able person, you had the right to injure that person and give them the same disability that you had. So very violent. And then the market of monsters refers to the slave trade, which is specifically people who are disabled. So they had a market for people who were able, but they were not classified as monsters. And the market of monsters were specifically people would buy and pay higher to have someone that looked disabled and be their slave. And then Augusta, who is a famous emperor and conqueror, he used people with disabilities as entertainment, and the term was coined as fools. Next slide, please. So the 12 tables refer to the beginning of the Roman Empire's laws. So this is like 1451 to 1450 BC, which is before Christ. I pulled these, this is a reference from Yale and Harvard, both historians went back and looked. But paternal pattern, this is specifically the law which was based on Aristotle's, the philosopher's philosophy that a nobly deformed child shall be immediately killed, and this was law. And then the second thing is, are we good? That works for me, thank you. All right, and then the second one is, this is what I thought was fascinating. This was referring to that people have the right to injure someone, or they could pay them a amount of money, but because they were quite the empire of violence, it was more than often that they would mutate someone else the same way they had been harmed as well. But one of the things I thought was also fascinating with the Roman Empire was things they gave exceptions to certain disabilities, and one of them specifically being blindness. And as I did this reading, it was very fascinating to me very quickly because the Romans, they highly regard communication and language. So if you were able to communicate and have fluent language, you were given a bit higher status. And there are actually a couple notable disabled people in the Roman Empire history who were basically, their parents realized their child had a disability and got basically a pardon from the governor at the time. And like when I looked at it, it was most common blind people. They would get pardoned by the governor at the time, and it was usually an uncle who was a advisor to that governor at the time. So it was really interesting, but if you were deaf or non-speaking, I learned today that people don't like the word nonverbal as much, and I understand why, and there's non-speaking. So I'm made to correct that. But deaf people and non-speaking people were at a disadvantage in court in the market. And it wasn't till later laws around 600 BC, I believe, that people were actually given an advocate. So Roman Empire, despite how violent they were towards people with disabilities, they were actually the first empire that gave an advocate in court, which I thought was pretty interesting when you think about history overall, and we see advocates in court today or an IEP meeting, which is what I do often as non-tertiary special education advocate. All right. And then, but because blind people had more likely had access to language, they were perceived to be able to contribute more to the Roman Empire. All right. And then let me see. Okay. Yep. All right. And then, as we know, Christianity was a big movement between the death and resurrection of Jesus. And if we look at the apostles as they traveled through the world and everything history, one of them was Paul, who went through the Roman Empire. But we have biblical scriptures, and we also have documented proof of Jesus Christ as the great physician. And this was, again, the first turn of history where we find that people with disabilities were more perceived positively. It was reinforced again that you should take care of people with disabilities and you should be compassionate to them. And Paul reinforced this in his journey, especially with the Christian church. So in the 4th century AD, which is after the death of Christ, the rise of Christianity led to more human practices towards people with disabilities. Infanticide, which is what I refer to with the Roman Empire, it did decrease over time. And helping the affiliated or the people who are afflicted with disability was a sign of strength. And it's really interesting because we're actually talking more about religion with this. All right. So I am not a religious expert of all religions, but I went to Stanford University and my undergrad, which is a Southern Baptist college of different things, but I took a world religions class. So I remembered a lot from just that alone, and it was fascinating. When you look at the history of disability and religion both. So we're gonna go through, and this is all the same time that Christianity became a movement. Other religions were also emerging as well. So Buddhism, people become disabled because of bad karma. So if you did something bad in your previous life and you were disabled in your next life, it's because you did something bad in the previous life. Because in Buddhism and especially Hinduism, they view everything as kind of a cycle. What differs between the two is the gods they serve and things and how you can have good karma again. So know that. Shiramesa Sangasam, yeah. So despite having bad karma, it was still encouraged because to get rid of bad karma in order to have good karma in the next life, you want to do good acts. So that's where they have philosophy on treating people with compassion with disabilities especially. Judaism, there's conflicting views of the Torah, and it was very interesting reading this because progressive Jews believe in compassion and everything with disability, just like as historical Jews did. But there was a lot of conflict, first of all, of who Jesus is. They believe he was a great prophet and stuff. So some people followed him, believing you should be compassionate to people with disabilities, and others not as much, because there was a lot of, let's see, there was different sectors of Judaism that you could say is equivalent. We see it today with Zionists. So the Torah does say to treat people with disabilities with compassion. And there are noble disabled people in the Bible, but disability is caused by God as a punishment for sin. And that's where it gets conflicting. You see that in the Torah. You actually don't see that in the Catholic and Christian Bible, which I think is interesting to notate. And then Islam actually was the most disability-friendly culture to me of all cultures, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And in Islam, and I'm not referring to Islam as in jihadists, because a lot of people mix up Islamic culture and Islam religion with what we think about when we think of Afghanistan, Palestine, and some of the more extremists. Okay, we're talking about our friends who are Islamic that are they're actually very peaceful people. But for Islam, they believe that the cause of disability is not attributed to wrongdoing by the disabled person or their parents. So it took a step further, because some people would believe in other religions that if you sinned as a parent, your child would be cursed, which I thought was really interesting. And that is prevalent with all of their teachings. I thought it was very fascinating to learn that the Islams believe that you are compassionate to people with disability, but the disabled person realizes they have a set of challenges. And instead of an able person who's Islamic would have the different challenges in order to reach Allah and everything, the disabled person had more internal challenges in order to reach Allah. So it was really interesting. All right, so the errors. Before I pop this, Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift, you know who Taylor Swift is? Yes, I feel like everybody should know Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift, famous artist. We see her on TikTok, everything. She did a whole entire tour called The Air. So I want everybody to guess, which air am I? Which one? Go ahead. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely Reputation. I would say my song is Look What You Made Me Do. And it's with good reason. And some of that goes to my personal story, which I'll share another time and everything. But I joke all the time that when you're an advocate, I like to say that Look What You Made Me Do is definitely the song of advocate sometimes, because it's like, all right, I have done it every way, the nice way. Look what you made me do. So Reputation is my error. All right. Let's see. Okay. All right. Make sure it's not skipping. So I'm gonna check real quick on to make sure this clicker is not skipping over, because I thought other parts were covered. So make sure we're not detecting difficulties. Let's see. Okay, we're good. All right. So now we go from the fall of the Roman Empire. So the emphasis on art, science, philosophy no longer existed. And then we get into the rise of religion and the church. So if we remember, we talked about the rise of Christianity. They were still controlled by the Roman Empire as well as other religions. What people don't realize, that's also when the Islamic conquest of the jihadists started. And they are part of the reason that the Roman Empire fell as well. So the whole Middle East and everything was fighting with the Roman Empire, which I thought was really interesting in terms of context of history. So this is where the rise of religion and the church started. And the emphasis was on the idea of God, and the sense of how can we reach God? Do we have a God that's saving us? Do we have a God that's protecting us? And there was a lot of on sin, purgatory, and good acts both. So the Middle Ages are referred to as the Dark Ages, and purgatory. So one of the things that was really fascinating to me as I studied religion in undergrad and everything and later in life, because being a pelvic floor physical therapist, my specialty was sexual trauma. So I dealt with a lot of church hurt and different religions, especially with church hurt and religion hurt. So it was very interesting. But one of the things that I completely blew away was the idea of purgatory. So I don't know, we have some Catholics here, and correct me if I'm wrong on certain things, but my husband is Catholic, so it was very interesting reading, especially the seven hells and the idea of purgatory. But this was very driven by the Dark Ages. So purgatory, the idea is you would face an intense amount of suffering after you die before you reach to heaven. And it's basically an atonement for your sins on earth. So this idea was very driven because we've lost access to art, to philosophy, and to science at this point. And everybody was driven by, okay, what am I going to do to save myself, basically? Because there was no hope, economic crisis and everything. So people turned to religion to atone and to repent for their sins, to save and have a place in heaven. And so what ultimately happened for people with disability was a couple of things. This is where the idea drives a lot that people with disability are the children of eternal God. So there was two sides of the equation, and they were both very extremists. You had people with disability were children of God, and therefore they must be provided compassionate care. But I'm doing this because I'm like a savior to them, and it's going to guarantee me more access to get into heaven. So that's one side. And the other side is you're disabled because you're punished by God, therefore you're going to hell. And it was really interesting because in some references, people believe that living with disability was your current purgatory on earth. So if you were a good disabled person, you would go automatically to heaven, not have to face purgatory again. Oh, sorry. So this is some artwork from around the village. Yeah. And I like this artwork because it demonstrates a lot. This is actually artwork based on exorcism, so excising demons. And this was actually referenced as disability artwork because one of the things that we're going to talk about it is the practice of excising evil spirits and how it negatively and harmfully hurt people with disabilities too. All right, so this is a shrine that was fascinating to me with the history of it. So this was one of the first Roman Catholic Church shrines in Glee, Belgium. And it was specifically a safe haven for people with mental disabilities and mental illness. But a lot of people would travel to this shrine to be cured. So it was a safe haven because at the time, if you had mental disability, you face a lot of darkness. People would try to capture you, try to throw you into what's known as idiot cages and different stuff and hurt you because you were basically their entertainment. So this is a shrine that I thought was really interesting, but they did focus a lot with purgatory, and one of the cures was trying to be as good of a person as possible. So it reinforced the idea of religion, especially Christian religion at this point. All right, so this is why I was talking about the idiot cages. So this was a big prevalent thing. And I want you guys, as we start talking about disability history, you're gonna start realizing the parallels to today that we still see. So idiot cages were a big thing. They were a way to capture people, especially people who were dumb and fools. So often a lot of people with intellectual disabilities were found in these cages, and people with mental illness as well. And these were publicly displayed cages in the center of the square. So Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is, a Disney movie, but the idea of that platform and everything, even though they didn't have a cage, that's basically where the idea of idiot cages came from. And then in addition to that, it was encouraged practice, the ship of fools. The ship of fools were literally a ship. If you were a person with disability, your parent would sell you to the ship. And you would get on this boat. And then the sailors of the ship would travel from their destination to the other port and charge admission for ships to park along your ships to watch the zoo, basically, of you. And then they would ban you on sea. So that's where disability history is really dark because we are witnessing genocide at this point. All right. And the Roman Catholic Church are the creators of the asylum. So in 1787 AD, the very first asylum, meaning a place of haven, but we know we view the word asylum very differently today. So I like to say with disability history, and other people say I feel like it just resonates well, there's moments of good intents, abuse later. And that's what we're going to be seeing a lot over and over again as we go through this. So the Roman Catholic Church in Milan, Italy, was Archbishop. It's the first recorded orphanage that we have in history for abandoned infants. And from this idea, these were also abandoned infants who had disabilities as well, because it was still frowned upon. There was a lot of shame that if your child had disability, it was encouraged that you gave up that child and tried again to have an able child. So it intended to be refuge for those in need. Like I said, good intent. And the movement did create what we see as orphanages, hospitals, and homes for the blind and aged. But truly, the condition of these were imprisonment at best. Let's make sure I saw that. Yep. Okay. So prior to the Middle Ages, people who had leprosy lived in segregated communities, segregated colonies out of the city. So these were basically equivalent to disability camps, you could say. Leprosy was a very violent disease. And though people realized there's a cure for later everything, but we see it in biblical scripture, other religious scriptures and documentation that leprosy was seen as a curse, and one that you got it because you sinned horribly, but it left lots of people with significant disability as well. So it was best practice that if they realized you had leprosy, they kicked you out of their entire community. Like you had to live outside, and it's usually a couple miles away outside the city. And they had to fight themselves to find food, water, resources. So what's really interesting about the history of colonies of people who had leprosy is they took really great care of each other. So I like to kind of joke, it's almost independent living in a sense, way before we even had a term for it. Go ahead. Dan's got something.
He is as well. Yeah, what interesting when you bring up, quote, the leper colonies. I think many of us have heard about Father Damien, and the work that he did in Hawaii with the leper colonies, but many people may not know that there was, quote, a leper colony in Carville, Louisiana, which existed for many years. In fact, they existed probably up until about certainly the 60s. And so there was a lot that wasn't known about leprosy, but of course, Carville is that facility has since closed, but so not too far from Alabama. I've not heard of a colony that we had here in the state of Alabama. Some of you may be familiar, but I think that's some history that is not too distant. That we saw that. In fact, I was talking to somebody a while back. I used to live in New Orleans, and so I didn't live too far from Carville, but I knew somebody who worked as a vocational rehabilitation at the Carville facility, but of course it's Hansen's disease, which, their treatments, and I don't know what the treatments for Hansen's was back then, obviously. Yeah, probably not very effective. So anyway, so I just say that because, that history is not, we're talking here about the Middle Ages, but now, moved in about 1960s, it's still happening, that segregation.
Absolutely. And that's where it's fascinating when you start to connect all the dots. It was this long ago, and yet it's not this long ago either. So, but one of the things I want to highlight with this is the Crusades. How many people are familiar with the Crusades were and the purpose for the Crusades? Okay. For you that are not familiar with the Crusades was actually the Christian militia response to the Islamic response, which I thought was fascinating on world history. So these colonies were taken and converted into hospitals, asylums, covenants, and orphanages, and to help take care of the disability and to take care of compassion. That makes sense, but really it was to save them. So one of the things I thought was fascinating is nuns, priests, monks. When I started reading through just the literature of why they were told to care for someone with disability, it was basically to overpass purgatory and ascend to higher levels, aka sainthood. What? Yes. Okay, that's fine.
Not all.
Not all, sorry, that's fair, yeah. But when I say all, like if you look at religions across the board, you'll see some of that emphasis as well, which I thought was interesting. So, all right, so people with disabilities were continually segregated and viewed the poorest losses unable to contribute. So we see a lot of the idea of, let's see, it's not there yet, the return of investment. So it's very fascinating. All right, and then after the Dark Ages, we get into the Renaissance era, which is the 1450 to 1650s. And with the Renaissance, we get back going from the idea of God into the idea of art, science, and philosophy return. Religion was still a very powerful influence, but society turned from science back to science to basically understand the world. And I would like to say it was almost a scale, like depending on where you live, the scale was higher on religion, and other parts of the world, the scale was higher on science. So it was just really interesting. All right, so with this, what's really important to recognize in terms of disability journey and history is there were a lot of healthcare advancements that started in terms of technology stuff. So you started having people doing surgery and realizing that you could keep people alive with surgery. You also had people understanding anatomy better and everything. And this is where I thought was interesting. Some references said there was a better understanding of disability through science, which is true because there's a couple people who realized, for example, epilepsy was thought to be cursed for a while, but epilepsy was actually known to be a seizure, and it's not necessarily a curse anymore. So people were starting to realize disabilities are not necessarily a sin and a curse. All right, and then what I thought was really interesting during this era, there was a set of laws called the Elizabethan Port Laws that were passed. So these laws were passed around 1563 to 1601. And the set of laws put the responsibility on the government to care for people with disabilities. So the idea was they needed basic care. And this is where we started to see the movement of alum houses. So basically homes for the unemployable, poor, and work houses. And what you see me quoting here is the definitions of how they split. So if you were viewed as someone who was a good person, but you just couldn't work, like the nice person and stuff, not a criminal, you got to be in the alum house. If you were somebody who was viewed as a criminal, and usually people with mental illness, they ended up in the workhouses because they were very poorly misunderstood. And then, but truly the conditions of this basic care was imprisonment as well. And it also pushed out the perspective that people with disabilities were social problems and burdens. But because of the SEV law, it led to the rise of alum houses around the world. And the first alum house, from what I've tracked of history, was in Boston, Massachusetts in 1622. And a famous one that people like to refer to in history is St. Oswald's Hospital. It's thought to be the first alum house in the world in England and was later converted to a hospital. All right, and then this is where I was talking about, I mentioned earlier, the medical model of disability. So we have to recognize religion, science, and eventually where the scale started shifting back and forth, and that eventually led to the idea of the medical model. The medical model for disability in the Renaissance era really goes all the way back to Italy. And I thought it was fascinating when I started looking at hospital history and everything. Italy was considered the best country at the time in the Renaissance era for hospital because of what they were doing. They had figured out how to create hospitals based on efficiency and staff and more sterilized conditions. So what happened is several of the Roman monasteries were converted into hospitals with physicians and nuns as nurses. And hospitals were utilized for the sick. And the sick was a very broad definition, but just people with disabilities were falling within this definition too, which I thought was interesting. But however, there's really little recorded history of hospitals for disabilities only, but there's documented history of government controlling hospitals and segregating them based on types of disease and conditions, which is why, to me, I hypothesize that you're not gonna see hospitals for disability only, but because they got put in with the sick as well. This was a time, like I said, healthcare advancement and stuff. We started to see the history, vaccinations are traced here, herbal medicine, so how people realized they could treat and save people from the Black Death and different stuff, or lessen the severity of it, herbal medicine. And the thing that was harmful in terms of medicine advancement was superstitions. So this goes back to the idea of you have a disability because you're cursed, or you're a witch and you're trying, like your disability will be a disease to other people where you will curse other people. So that's where religion came back into science just across the whole world. And like the picture I showed earlier, disability was thought of evil as demons and people in certain places as well. And there was a rise of frontal lobotomy with people with mental disabilities in the pursuit of science. So that's where we have to appreciate some things that science did give us an advancement, but we also have to recognize who often were the victims of science as well. So this is medical model portraying art. I sound realize not. This is a couple physicians performing a lobotomy. All right, and we get into the Reformation era, which is 1517 to 1648. the Reformation era, and that's where people get confused. When you look at the dates, people have to realize the Renaissance era was going on and the Reformation era was also kind of going parallel as well. And I got guilty of that. I always thought they were very separate categories. And then I started to realize with the dates, they kind of go together. So you can think of the Renaissance era to be your science and more art and philosophy. Your Reformation era is your more religious driven era as well. So that's why I gave the analogy. It was really a scale of going on in the world, of going up, down, and depending on where you were in the world, you may see more Renaissance, you may see more Reformation. So this is where the rise of the Protestant church started as well in a response to the Renaissance movement. And it was very fascinating to me just reading through all of that too. But it specifically started, people say the Protestant church movement started with Martin Luther's 95 Thesis. So some historians reported that he advanced the idea disabilities had the full human value, but others argue that he remained convinced that people with disabilities were a result of devilry and witchcraft. So there was like a lot of conflict as well in the religious world with where do people with disability fall in all of this. And then John Calvin, who a lot of people think of also as one of the father of the Protestant church movement, he believed that people with disabilities were not among the chosen with his doctrine of predestination, that they were cursed and therefore they were not chosen. And then this is where the rise of exorcism really rose over the Reformation era. And the history of excising is very complicated, but in terms of disability, people with disabilities were often excised to release their demons, especially those with mental disabilities. So my food for the thought with this is how do the attitudes and the perspective of disability as evil and madness still impact today? All right, so just a little humor with all that. I like this one. I'll let you all read it. So, I like this one. Yeah. All right, so we get into the 17th and 18th centuries. So this is 1600 to 1800. So we get through all the errors and economy is starting to improve slowly. And there was a big emphasis on the study of human nature at this point, which is the idea that ideas come from human experience. And this a lot was pushed by the idea that the mind is a blank slate, and thus how the mind is developed is due to human experience. So when you really look at when enlightenment and disability started, you see a lot of the beginning of special education, which I thought was really interesting. The philosopher John Jacques Rousseau believed that learning should happen with agreement of child's cognitive speed, with limited outside influences from society in order to achieve a higher moral learning for the child. And this led ultimately to the creation of asylums for people with disability to access education, which were dominant at the turn of the 19th century. So I thought this was interesting because some people are like, when did special education start? And if you start tracing slowly to when orphanages were offering education or places for people to have training or care for their disability, you start to see a slow emphasis of people being educated. So it was based more on moral education philosophy. People with disabilities were able to start accessing opportunities to learn with the observations of researchers and philosophers. So Charles Michael Lepp was one of the first people that started a first public school for people with disabilities in France in this era. And Jacob Rose Puri was an educator in Portugal who instructed deaf mutes and taught them to hear and speak by touch and vibration through their muscles. And then Valentin Hu was a French philosopher who opened the Royal Institute for the Blind, which is known as the National Institute for the Blind Youth in Paris today. And this is where his pupil, Louis Braille, helped him develop Braille further today to teach people with blindness to read at Hayes School. So you're going to see certain advancements that come out of this time period, but it also leads to the question of how are they observing these people as well. So like I said, good intents become abused eventually. So John Mark Gasser Itar, he supported Raleigh's noble savage belief, which is the idea that if you have a blank mind and you're exposed to things that are very savage-like, you'll become, yeah. And the philosopher convex civilization viewed both, which is a view that knowledge comes through all the senses. So Hittar was also profoundly influenced by Pierre's work with educating the deaf mutes. So this guy, who was a philosopher, he decided, after hearing reports of a boy named Victor, who was abandoned in the woods of Abbey in France, who apparently had been raised by the wolves. He decided to find the boy and take the boy to his house to conduct his own observational medical and scientific experiments. And the idea was he wanted to see if the validity of this like slate of mind concept, that a person could become or be made into whatever one wants. So it's suspected by historians that Victor was probably his early teens and a child of a severe mental disability who likely had been abandoned by his parents, because parents were still criticized and demonized for having children with disabilities at the time. So because Victor had been raised in the woods, he'd never been exposed to civilization. So he wanted to see if he could civilize Victor ultimately. So what happened, do you think? So the blank slate of Victor would be filled with carefully selected information. So therefore, to Hittar, Victor was the perfect candidate for his study. But I just put quotes because I thought it was really interesting. I was reading this. So the observators, scientists got tired of working with him because he was not seeing great gains that he hoped for, gave up his hope for Victor becoming supernormal. Living outside of society had not necessarily protected Victor from unnatural wants and corruption, as Rosalind's philosophy suggested. They had only deprived him of language, guidance, comfort, and human affection. And even with his limited success, Hittar did prove that children with mental disabilities could improve to some extent. This would have been a positive influence from many educators the following century. So I find this to be very interesting because he had some improvement. He learned how to socialize people a little bit, but he was also deprived of several other things as well. So, let's see. So this is where we start to see the turn of, we have asylums at this point, orphanages, different places, and places where people could get education. But then we start to see a drive, the medical treatment being institutionalization. So there's starting to be a rise on confinement laws protecting the public from people with mental disabilities, and several of these laws looked at the sense of if you knew somebody who was mentally insane or something, and they were known as a danger to the community, so therefore they need to be institutionalized. So one of the famous asylums that I saw in history when I was doing my research was Britain's Bethlehem Asylum, which was known as Bedlam as well. And then France's Hospital General Paris were two of the notable ones that had confinement laws for children with disabilities, people with mental disabilities especially, to be removed from the public. And ultimately, institutionalization, we know, is against free will. And most of these people lived chained to the walls, built for prison, and they were continued to be exhibited to public for a fee. So it goes back to the idea that people who have disabilities are a source of entertainment. So, and it was said by some of the philosophers that people believe that mental illness was nonetheless viewed somewhat genetically. So treatments were similar to those of physical illnesses. So the idea being that mental illness was a type of disease, so they were trying to get rid of the mental illness. And that's where purges, bleedings, emics happen. All right, and this is just some artwork from scientists and stuff of treatment of people with mental disabilities, especially in asylum. So we see a lot of torture, which is pretty hard to see. All right, and then the return on investment syndrome started around this time, which was an ableist idea. So Thomas Malthus was an economist in the UK, and he was concerned with the population growth overall across the whole world, leading to a shortage in food supply. And now we remember we kind of came out the dark ages and everything, we have all the errors. So there was still fear of, do we have enough resources to share? And so he advocated for the elimination of people with disabilities to protect the food supply due to their lack of normal and unable to contribute, which led to the idea on the return on investment syndrome. So the ableist idea that one must look normal or make specific contribution to society in order to live is not new. And we see this all the time. We even see this in our laws today. I would make that argument. So go ahead.
Yeah. As I was going through that the other day, I was thinking about the return on investment concept, and I think I think we may still be buying into that. You know, ourselves. I think we've been guilty of this. Some of us have been guilty of that because, you know, we've been advocating for years for home and community-based services, right? And one of the arguments is it doesn't cost as much to put somebody in an institution. So in a sense, we're kind of making that return on investment argument, if that makes any sense. When in fact, it may cost more for an individual to have all the resources and supports they need to live in the community. And the fact that it's not, quote, cost effective shouldn't enter into the equation, but it does all the time. If you look at waivers, Medicaid waivers, and maybe is somebody from ADAP going to be coming to talk about the waivers? But at some point you'll learn a lot more about the waivers if you're not familiar with them. But that's always an argument that we've used, okay, going to the state house, advocating for home and community-based services, that they are more cost effective, when in fact, the real reason we're there is to argue for more humane services so people can live more independently with greater dignity. And so I think that's something that when we use that argument, you know, you can see it goes back to what year is that, Jess?
This is the 17th, 18th century. So the economist was 1766 to 1843 was his
Yeah.
lifespan.
Yeah, so that's going,
Mhm.
you know, that argument we've been using sometimes goes back that far.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be aware of that when we make these arguments to our legislators.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So, and around this time is when the Industrial Revolution started. So in terms of economics, what's important is people were still looking for food sources and stuff. So it led to the rise of a mass movement of a lot of people moving closer to urban cities, looking for work opportunities and different stuff as well. I don't think of Industrial Revolution as like big factories overall. That does come a little bit later, especially in the States, but more just in general that there are bigger job opportunities. But the sad reality was most of these job opportunities were minimal enslaved wage or really poor conditions, resulting in disease, higher injuries. And child labor definitely was on the rise of this entire time and represented most of the workforce. And children with disability were sold to factories intentionally to get rid of them. And the idea with disability at this point was their parents would sell them to the factories and for some money, but it was thought for every 10 child you gave to the factory that were healthy, the people would negotiate to take one disabled child just to get rid of that child off their hands. So it's pretty much slave trade at this point. All right, I need some water. We're gonna take a break. We're gonna keep going. Ready to get back into it? Okay, so before we move forward, I just want to give an opportunity for us to have some discussions and stuff, just to kind of get to know each other a little bit and everything. And I do know that they said we'll break at 3:30 so y'all can check in and stuff. And I'm okay with pausing again for that. That's not a big deal, even if we're still talking and everything. Does that sound good to y'all? Okay, all right. And then if there's anything that you feel like I didn't talk about, I'm happy to have a private talk afterwards because I'm always open to learning. Honestly, part of history is being open to learning and everything, and I'm all for that. So I want to ask this question today, based on what you've heard so far, what are just a couple of things that you feel like you continue to see and witness in terms of same themes in today's history? Things we cover in history in today's day. So does anybody want to go first? Things that you see today?
I'm Ashley Combs. Oh yeah, you can hear. Okay. Well, kind of going off of I forgot your name. I'm sorry. Mr. Dan's comment from before we went to break, how society, as I had introduced to everybody else, I'm going for my master's degree and I'll eventually want to work with ADRS as a vocational counselor. And one thing that we see commonly is society has such a stigma and fear of coming off of government assistance and trying to go get a job and trying to find that empowerment and their own income and that freedom, because you, in your mind, especially now with the economies increasing so bad and so much, that you might give a certain amount of check, but that doesn't really cover the necessities of how the inflation is. And so that fear of being able to survive, you know, it plays a big role. And we're seeing that a lot, especially now that COVID hit. It's actually more, it's, I think it increased by 25% over the last couple of years of them, families not advocating now, and individuals with disabilities not advocating for themselves to try to get into the workforce. And we still have a stigma of being accepted in the workforce and not being seen as somebody that is going to be a burden on the job placement, you know.
Hello, my name is Michelle, and I just had a thought about the religious aspect or related to what we've been listening to. We often hear in churches that, and this kind of bothers me because I have a son with autism, that you should just pray, you know. And although I am a Christian, I am also quite clear in the fact that, you know, if you're going to pray everything away, then everything would be perfect. So what happens if you pray and pray and pray and nothing happens? So that can lead to a cycle of guilt. And so, you know, to me, that is a modern day picture of what we've been discussing.
For a really long time, a lot of people would lay hands on deaf people, especially people who were non-speaking, because that's not their language. The language is not spoken language, it's signed languages. So it was very harmful, and yeah, absolutely. And I have had a couple people come up to me like, I'll be praying for your healing. I'm deaf genetically. I don't know how that works. Be praying for my healing at that point. So okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Godwin Powell. I guess I wanted to talk about, or go back to the era of getting rid of, no, that's a bad word, but allowing the children to die if they are disabled. I'm from Nigeria. My mom is originally. And so it amazes me because that's still an issue. And for me personally, my sister was born in 73, I believe, and she was a premature. She was 6 months. And my mom she always said, I had to run away and go to London because she was born in Nigeria because they were going to kill my sister because she was a premature. And that's 1970. And so, and it still happens now, you know. I know, like, again, like I said, I know in villages for sure, you know, a child comes out disabled, they just throw them in the water, they drown them. And that's today. So it just amazes me how things that are going on that went on before Christ is still happening in this generation. And it saddens me for countries like that are in Africa because they don't have the resources. They don't have the advocates. They don't know what to do, you know, and they're still with that mindset of, oh, you're cursed, you know, you're a demon, you're a witch. Okay, let's go and do an exorcism on you. That doesn't work, then let's get rid of you. So it's just a sad situation all around. So I'm grateful to be here to try to learn how to be the advocate, you know.
Favorite nonprofits is called Destiny Rescue. If y'all want to know, it is a Christian-based nonprofit, but focus on sex trafficking, but specifically families who sold their children. And they do also track disability people. And it's cool because they work with the national governments of countries to go and save people as well. They have their own special force and everything. So that was really cool meeting some of them recently, but learning stats as well. Go ahead.
This is Perry Loreno, and I want to highlight, I guess Itard, is that Itard, the boy in the Itard, where he was trying to, yeah, Victor. Yes, thank you. So he was trying to, in my mind, it sounded like he was trying to fix Victor, right? And so I feel like that is a common theme that we see today. bet you all of you have been served an ad on Facebook about how you could fix your child's disability. That is an insult. So if we can better, serve ads that are supporting our children, not fixing them, because there's nothing to be fixed.
And Peril, yeah.
So we see the importance of this group, this class.
Hi, everybody. This is Linda. I noticed the conversation about religion and prayer and all that. Prayer helps me deal with what I'm going through. So I don't know if that's what a lot of people, I know I need grace when I say things to people, and other people probably need grace too. It doesn't come out the right way sometimes. So I have to try and think of what are they really trying to tell me or mean. And maybe it's like, maybe praying will help you through it. Maybe it's not going to cure it. Like, I've got a daughter with a disability. It's genetic. It is what it is. So, I'm trying to think that too, because I know it's a common thread, but it does help me. It helps my church community, helps me through. So I just wanted to add that.
Like, I'm not a certain faith, but I do love Jesus. And one of the things for me is you can't pray away disability, but you can pray for comfort, and you can pray for peace and other things as well, which I think is what Linda is saying here. I like that, because I think that's the reality, but it's important to have these conversations, because it's why I like to say good intents gone wrong sometimes. So, and we see that across other cultures as well too. Okay.
Hey, this is Renee. Also, sometimes people are just absolutely ridiculously uneducated. I have other words, but I won't say them when I'm being videoed. But when I was listening to all of this, also I'm seeing where the populations were segregated, right? And we, especially in the disability community, are just really proud about how we don't segregate our kids, but it's unfortunately not the truth. We still segregate everywhere I go, where I live. These kids are allegedly included in life, and they are not at all. And so I don't think that's changed. I mean, are we killing them? No. Well, sometimes, but no. Okay. But are we including them in life, with dignity and with the grace that they deserve? Absolutely not. We are not.
Absolutely on that. And that's one of the things that is really fascinating for me. It's a entire lecture itself. We'll put it that way. I share that I'm oral deaf. So one of the things that I've been accused as a disabled person who's deaf, you must speak my lived experiences, I'm promoting genocide of my own deaf community, because of a lot of the hurt with autism perspectives. And it's very valid, because there was a point that deaf people and cochlear technology and hearing aids were perceived as a cure for deafness. And that's where the medical model did traumatic harm to the deaf community and my deaf culture both. But I do think it's appreciation. We have certain technologies, but we need to teach people to view things as tools, as a way to access something rather than a cure. But that is the fault of medical professionals as well. So it's something we have to absolutely acknowledge, because it's been pushed throughout history. People were used to be experimented on and stuff, and deaf people were used to be experimented on. So.
It's Ashley again. I was going to also say, they think they're doing us a favor by including them and having that inclusion, but then it's more ignorance, more shown. Like my son's, our former school that we were at, they wanted to make a disability kickball team. And I was like, okay. I was like, so is that going to be, intellectual disability, physical disability, like what? Oh, it's everybody. I was like, so if you have somebody that is wheelchair mobiled, how are they going to, oh, well, we can kick the ball for them. Oh, I went to the Board of Education and had a very long talk with the Board of Education, because that's not how you do that. We've got to find other ways.
Go ahead.
Mine is in reference to we're still putting them away, and we're still putting them away. And the reason I say that is I'm a big advocate of, he loves to party and hang out. So I'm a big advocate of getting out in the community, whatever. So Huntsville did a a fundraiser for families with disabilities. But they did it for the community. The problem is no one there knew why they were there. They didn't realize that the money they paid was going supposedly towards the community of disability. And then nobody there was there to even talk about disability. So they're just kind of hanging. Nobody spoke on it. And I was real irritated because we went purposely because this is what they said they were doing. And so, of course, my babe's going to get out there and do whatever. And I allow him to be him no matter where we go. And we felt, okay, let me say this. We would have felt out of place, but I've done it so much, it don't bother me anymore. But we would have really felt out of place. And then people would come and ask me questions, which is fine. But even somebody made a comment. I know this person didn't really mean any harm, but they was like, I would just like not bring him during these hours. And I was like, you do know what this event was for? And then they actually did. And they was like, oh, like, did you not read it? You just bought the tickets and came out. And so it was kind of like they were saying, it's okay, but since he's kind of different, let's just, not let him come during these hours. And so like still educating the community on, no, it's okay for him to be here too.
Like we see all our experiences of different stuff, we all have very broad experiences, but we continue to see the same patterns of that same cycle still continue to go on, and what even maybe not as severe as certain times in certain countries and certain cultures as well. It's still something that we need to recognize. And we'll definitely be hitting that, especially the movements tomorrow. So, all right. I'm taking a deep breath because institution. Okay. You hear me stumble on this word so many times. I have speech apraxia. So a little background on me. I was born deaf to 2 hearing parents. I'm actually the oldest of 3 children. We're all deaf. And we all have co-parent technology. My sister's the youngest co-parent recipient in the state of Alabama at 8 months old. And part of that was because my mother, she was a fantastic advocate. And she abided by a lot of the regulations known as the Joint Commission on Hearing. She fought for that. And in a system that didn't want to support us. That's a whole nother story. But because I was misdiagnosed. People thought my deafness was only moderate severe. I'm actually profoundly severely deaf. And it wasn't until we flew all the way to Pennsylvania. I was born November 1993. It wasn't until we flew to Pennsylvania in 1995, October, that they realized I'd been misdiagnosed the whole time. They were trying to do hearing aids, but hearing aid technology was not the same thing at the time with a little bit of sign. But my sign through the state of Alabama early intervention was only 15 minutes once a month, which is not effective for effective communication truly. So that's why my mom chose spoken language. My mom is also first generation American from Germany. My great grandfather worked for Hitler. And yeah, so we're gonna get into eugenics today. And my great grandfather was one of the rocket scientists. He was actually trialed and declared he worked under duress. We have documentation that certain family members of our history were sent to camps. And he had to work for duress because he was responsible for basically the shuttle part of Saturn V. So he's the reason for it launching. He's the reason that missiles exist with his team. But he was sold to the French government. And that's why a lot of people don't realize the German scientists is that United Nations, basically to make the space race fair, they split all the scientists. So he was sent to the French government. Von Braun brought him to Huntsville, Alabama. So that's how my mom got here. But she had a lot of appreciation because my grandfather spoke 17 languages. We were talking about this earlier. So she understood language acquisition and which I needed for my disability and different stuff. And for her, what was hard with recognizing all this history and stuff, because we talked a little bit about it, is one of the reasons that she chose spoken language for us was at the time, the School for the Deaf wasn't doing us super well either. And for us, we live in Huntsville, Alabama, and my mom did not feel comfortable as a parent sending me away because the only option at the time for the Alabama School for the Deaf was to be boarded there as a young child. They do some great work. It's not me saying I'm anti-deaf schools, but it's something that we had to recognize. So that was part of the reason that I was raised the way I was, because my mom wanted an opportunity to raise me at home. So institutionalization history it's very hard and it's very uncomfortable, because as we get into it, we're going to realize very quickly how the US was a big driver for a lot of things in the world. So institutionalization history, we start more in the 1800s, 1950s. So, all right, so around this time, it was very clear social classes based on wealth. there was the poverty class and the wealthy class. So if you had disability and your family is wealthy, you were mostly likely raised by your family. And this is something that we do have to acknowledge today. I'm very thankful. My family, my dad had a good job, you know, he started a company and everything when we were young. My parents were able to keep me home and they had to fight for their own resources. That makes sense, but they were able to keep me home because we had wealth. But if you don't have that same wealth, then you are at a bigger disadvantage, and that's the system. So it led to the rise of poor houses, which were basically the same word for alum houses for people with disabilities. And this was very prevalent, especially in the United States. And it became practice to warn out. And this is going to be very triggering because it's equivalent to sundown towns. If you're a person with disability, it was common practice. If you try to come to a town, you were told that you were not welcome in that town. And where do we think we got the idea on towns, especially in the South? So history repeats itself. All right, so intellectual disability. Now, I'm one of those people with the history of disability. There is a reference, the primary word for intellectual disability for a long time is mental retardation. So I have intentionally chosen, out of respect and everything for the history and all that, I switched a lot of the word mental retardation into intellectual disability. But I know that there's a bridge because mental retardation eventually was falling more under developmental disabilities. So if you hear the word intellectual disability or developmental disability, still think of the like broad category. So, all right. So Jonathan Dominic was a philosopher who and observer both. He started categorizing intellectual disabilities through his like research into two categories. And the categories were imbeciles and idiocy. So again, Latin idios, idiot, we start to see that history keeps being pushed. And the idea was here that if you're an imbecile, you're more well-formed, you looked more normal. Your organization, so it goes all the way back to the Greek and Roman philosophy of perfection again. If you looked more normal and stuff, you have your own intellectual process and be able to do stuff. You just weren't a perfect man, then they were allowed in society. But if you were in the idiocy or idiot category, it was basically a reference to a person with little to no intellectual functioning, incapable of attention, cannot control their senses. They hear, but do not understand. They see, but do not regard. Having no ideas and thinking not, they have nothing to desire, therefore have no need of signs nor speech. And we probably can all guess what happened. Most people were categorized as idiots. Remember. All right. Let's see. I guess I repeated that slide twice. So his work in an attempt to categorize the difference between mental retardation and insanity with scientific symptoms. So this was really the work. He specifically did some research and stuff, and he was trying to give symptoms based on how people were acting. So this is something to keep in mind. All right, and then while that was all going on, we have one of our first really great advocates, Dorothy Hicks. She was a person, she did not have a disability, but she worked with people who were affected and had disabilities as well. But her work ultimately started as a Sunday school teacher at the Massachusetts Corrections for Women Inmates. And then she turned into a social activist based on her experiences. And she was appalled at the living conditions of the women inmates, and it led her to collect evidence of the treatment of people with mental disabilities as she traveled for the next 2 years to visit jail, alum houses, poorhouses, and asylums to observe their conditions. Let me look back my note because I have the number that she visited. So, let's see. All right. I want to say, I don't have the exact number, but she visited over 200 institutions. And it was very significant in 2 years, and she was going after and after. But because of her dedication to work and to observe, and she started documenting everything, and this is a quote by her. So this is actually her speech, but because she was a woman, she could give the speech. Because remember, this is 1800s, 1950 timeframe, so women suffrage had not happened at this point yet. So her ally was, I won't read the speech for a minute, but her ally was Samuel Griddle Howe, who we'll get to him in history. But Samuel Howe basically read her speech at Congress to plead for people with disabilities and their rights and stuff. So this is some of the documentation and stuff that she had gathered, how people with disabilities were being treated in all the places that she visited and stuff. And the biggest thing I like to highlight here is these people have been now abandoned to the most loathsome necessities or subjected to the 5 lists and outrageous violations. So Dorothy was unable to testify because she was a woman. So Samuel Howe, a well-known social reformer, gave her speech. And basically her ask to Congress as an advocate and social activist at this point was, she wanted Congress at the time to accommodate people with disabilities with federal funding. And the proposal was there was 5,000 acres of land in a trust and use the income from the trust to be used to help people with mental disabilities especially. And what's interesting, it actually passed through both houses of Congress, so the houses and the Senate at the time, but was vetoed by President Pierce. And the reason he vetoed it was due to worries that such a law might make the federal government financially responsible, not only for the indigent insane, but also all the poor of the United States. And I like to say that's an example of return on investment. Go ahead.
You know, that kind of reminds me, it seems a little familiar, what we're hearing about Medicaid expansion in the state of Alabama. You know, well, we can afford it now, but boy, what's going to happen 10 years down the road? Well, we see what the example is, and this is my soapbox right now, but I think that's something that, you know, we see, as President Pierce said, well, you know, how are we going to, you know, we're going to have all these other individuals, people, indigent people asking for services, and we're going to be responsible for all the poor in the United States. But we still see that at the federal level too. I mean, in terms of, you look at our political environment that we're in, I mean, but this has been going on forever. But for right now in Alabama, this has been going on for the last 10 years where we've been running into this.
So it's just fascinating to think about history continues to repeat itself. She continued to work as an advocate and stuff, but basically after this, she just basically focused on just being a good social worker and just assisting people with disabilities after this. So, all right. And then this is when schools for disabilities started. And the reason I say schools, quotation marks, I don't want you to think of like your normal public school, like what we envision today. These were more like, a lot of them actually started in churches, which was really cool. But the idea was it was a training school for children with disabilities. In the 1840s to 1850s across the world is when it started. And this is what I like to say. When it started with good intents, these training schools eventually turned into institutions that did not have academic emphasis or community interaction, and rather were a place where people with disabilities received custodial care. And custodial care means it's equivalent of prison care. So ultimately, training schools eventually became prisons for people with disabilities due to overcrowding, understaffed, and segregated facilities tending towards abuse and neglect. And this led to the widespread of private institutions later, especially in the United States, because I like to say, follow the money. So, but for the bad training schools, this is where we're gonna start with what was good, intense with good training schools. And one of the good intense was Edward Sion. Sorry, he's French, so Sion. He was a doctor in France who studied under Itard, which I found really interesting. But like I said, good intense. So, and he later became the director of the School for Idiots and the Salvatore Asylum. And he is famous for his research. He believed that mental deficiency was caused by a weakness of the nervous system and could be cured by the process of motor and sensory training. So the idea is he created a curriculum that had some academics, but he also created like a physical program where these people who with disabilities also got exercise to what they could exercise for, and they had training in their senses. So they had training with hearing. So if you have somebody hearing loss, they were trying to work on getting them hearing. Smell, vision, taste, and hand-eye coordination is really interesting. My background is physical therapist, so I have good friends that are occupational therapists. So I find this part of history interesting just because of they actually referred to this history a little bit about how OT started, which I thought was an interesting fact. And what people don't realize is his theory was teaching methods influence Montessori, which is what a lot of moms like to use. And it's really cool, the art of Montessori, but his teaching beliefs, like the good ones, influenced that Martha Montessori. Like she came and she was a pupil under him at one point. So I thought it was kind of interesting history on that. So good intense, for now, you know. And honestly, out of all the people and observers, we're to find out later, he protested when institutions started becoming institutions. So, but it goes into that medical model of good intents, and then eventually others abuse it, if you get where I'm going. Yep, bye. Okay, just let me know, we'll do our break. Okay. All right, and then this is Sam Gridley Howell. So this is the guy who I shared that he ended up having to give Dorothy Dix a speech for her, but he was also a social reformer as well. In 1848, while he was the director of the Perkins Schools for the Blind, which is a fantastic school today, he established the Massachusetts School for the Idiot and Feeble-Minded Youth. And the idea behind this, it was an experimental boarding school with an emphasis on family and community, both, to where the children were prepared to live with the rest of society. So basically, the parents had a choice to board their children at the school. He taught them academics, life skills, and different stuff. And they, as they aged, they moved back home to their families and became more members of the community. And a lot of what they did, and that, and we see at Perkins School today, is it's very community and family driven. So good intent of what, if you are really are going to separate in that sense, I don't really believe in segregation and hardcore, but he was providing a place of families could come for resources and everything, and they were still a part of the community. So good intents there. And that was his belief. So the thing to know about history at this point in time, the philosophy at the time in America was the belief of phrenology was strong. So the practice of studying the shape of the skull to determine human characteristics and functions, leading several to believe that idiots could be taught. So what this is referring to is, especially friends of mine who have Down syndrome, if you are a person with Down syndrome, you are often studied like with cranial measures and everything. And basically, the bigger your brain, the more capacity you had to learn. That's what it was referring. So there was some science going on in terms of observation, but with an emphasis on, okay, based on the person's looks and presentation, how smart can they be? Which is bothersome to think about. All right, boarding schools for disabilities was a big surge in the US. So what people don't realize that is Dr. Stein was a friend. He moved to the States. So he ended up being one of the primary educators in the States along with Dr. Howell. And then there's another guy named Harvey Wilbur. And this beginning of boarding schools was actually in people's homes. So Wilbur started a school in his home in New York that helped lead to the surge of boarding schools across children, because parents realized like, oh, I have a place where my child has opportunity to learn, has an opportunity to have life skills. So demand increased. So boarding schools started to increase in demand. And at the time, the superintendents of these schools had a strong emphasis on education and advancing and having good intentions for people with disabilities. They followed science teaching methods, as students should receive physical training for motor and sensory skills, basic academics and instruction for social and self-help skills. But demands increased for the number of boarding schools. Therefore, the rise of institutions also was that. How are we on time, Brooke? Good pause right now. All right, 2 minutes. Okay. All right, so attitudes toward children with disabilities. So this was a letter written to Dr. Howell and they basically pull out the names of what the attitudes of people in America still really truly at the time, even though some people viewed boarding schools for students with disabilities as a positive thing. This was still the attitude of society, and I highlight it here. So this is a letter to a Howell from a guy who knows James. So the statement being, this boy has grown to be exceedingly troublesome, escaping from home as often as possible and causing his parents much anxiety. Of late, they have felt obliged to confine him in the cellar during the father's enforced daily absence. I beg you that you will give the case your kind consideration, and assure is worthy one and deserving prompt treatment. So we still continue to see the medical model at play ultimately with academics both. It's an interesting letter, yeah, because a lot of the thoughts behind the boarding schools, they're still treating. We're still treating, we're still curing people with disability. All right, and at the same time, the US Census did one of the biggest census for mental retardation. So the US performed a census for intellectual disabilities, and the census data that I have up here was taken from 1850 to 1890. It was reformed every 10 years. So there's data 1850, 1860, so on. But starting in 1850 to 1890, the increase in people with intellectual disabilities went from 7% to 15%. And the belief and the increase was due to the large number of defective immigrants. Because around the time, this is when the United States had its huge surge in immigration as well through Staten Island, New York, and all of that as well. So it's really important to realize that part of the reason the percentage looked bigger was because the population of the United States was also bigger because of the immigration movement too. But people used this data to argue for larger institutions. But the argument also discounted the significant rise in the entire US population at the time. We good? Okay, so good intentions. Due to the work of the following social reformers, especially Dorothy Dix, it was a hope that proper training could lead to improved quality of life for people with disabilities as they could be integrated into their community and live productive lives. And I'm using the word productive lives because that was the idea at the time. Like they believed by giving train, they could give back. So kind of back to return of investments, really ultimately. And the underlying belief was through proper education and humanitarian means, the lives of people with disabilities who were considered deviants could be made into the undeviant to change them to fit better into the world. And this is an example of the law of ableism. So, anything going wrong? So, Civil War occurred. We had a huge mass integration in, and the Civil War occurred. And it was after the Civil War, there was a huge economy shift as there was increased competition for jobs with low number of jobs, really, because people were emancipated, people had citizenship at this point, and there wasn't work either. And there was also a lot going on and traditional with that in terms of civil rights. So we have to think about civil rights, and I have a civil rights timeline to help us see better with that. But you have to also think this is where civil rights era was really starting, because we had Civil War, people of color, Black people, and people with different racial minorities now who were born a US citizen, had the right to freedom and all the rights and protections. So that's something you have to remember. I like to highlight the fact that if you look at the law, they were still emphasizing people had to be born US citizen proof, and that is a very complicated history on top as well, because people continue to be oppressed as well. But historian James Trent wrote, in a growing, increasing industrialized nation, communities did not need idiots, not even educated ones. I thought it was really interesting because this was a historian from after the Civil War who wrote this at his time. And why I thought this was interesting because people were taking advantage of people with disabilities because they weren't educated enough, or if you didn't have enough education either, you were given pretty much slave wages still, or you were pretty much into labor at that point for way less wages as well. So that's what we have to recognize as history. So then it became two extremes, especially related to the training schools. Pupils from training schools who returned to their communities to look for work usually end up in poorhouses or jails. And then parental demand for placement of their children in these schools also increased. Schools were not big enough for the demand at the time. Do we need to pause now, Brooke?
I mean, I don't know how everybody is. We just took a break. If you want to go another 15 minutes or so. I don't know how you're feeling.
Let me see. All right, so while I look at this, we can look at this graph, but I like graphs because they give you visual, they give you good pictures. Because the whole idea of this graph is what we were discussing that happened at the time. The rise demand for institutions was going greater, but it ultimately led to a decrease in the quality and the commitment to training, because the mindset flipped from, okay, we're going to provide people who have disabilities an opportunity to learn life skills and academics both, and to how many can we fit? Because parents were paying a fee in order to send their child there. So I like to say follow the money again on that. So by 1875, a large number of states began to build custodial institutions. So the focus switched completely from a training school, which was supposed to be more academic driven, life skill building and different stuff, into custodial institutions, because and education was ultimately sacrificed and everything. And if you look at that, a lot of it was due to government funding, because they realized that by sending people to institutions, the government of that state would also get the money back on the institution, which has led to the rise of custodial institutions too. All right, so, and what a lot of training schools happen is they were flipped basically into institutions. And David Vail was a philosopher, but he studied what was happening to the people of institutions, and he talked about the dehumanization process of these institutions, because that's exactly what it was. It was dehumanizing, because instead of going there with the expectation that you were going to learn functional skills and stuff, you were given and learning skills to do your job, to provide labor back to the institution that you were at. All right, so we're gonna watch this video because this is based on, this video is like a nice little summary of David Vail's work in the book he wrote on the dehumanization and the total institution. But are we gonna be able to play that or not, Alex?
We can try.
Okay.
We can give it a shot.
Can you make my notes smaller? Would that make it visible?
Audio with it?
If not, it's okay. I can encourage, we can share the link and y'all can go back and watch it. But it's, yeah, we can share, okay, so that works. Okay. It was just really good. He went around and observed the conditions of institutions that were converted from training schools into custodial institutions, and the idea of how dehumanization started. And it's equivalent. It's slipping from my mind right now, but there is a great documentary on Netflix about the history of prisons in the US, especially the, yeah, what's it called?
No.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And that's exactly what it was. But a lot of the dehumanization book was about, and basically people use it to what is prisons today as well. How you strip the people down from the beginning, you strip them their everything, you strip their humanity, and you force them to force work as well. So that's ultimately what the whole point of this was about. Let's see. Oh, I just messed that up. Okay. Let's see. Let's go back. Okay, great. All right. So with all of this, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor, but it's something I like to highlight on because the study, when you look at the when you look at the state of institutions that are truly custodial institutions, today's specialists in psychology consider being institutionalized as an adverse childhood experience. And that is backed by science and research both. So adverse child experience is any type of traumatic experience, not the same term as PTSD, but equivalent to PTSD, because you've been stripped of your affection, you've been stripped of the ability to be able to build social relationship, other life skills as well. And it does negatively impact brain development. And it's a dose response relationship, which means the longer you stay, or the younger a child, and the longer I stay in an institute, the higher risk for behavioral disorders, social, behavioral, cognitive, neurophysiological. I see this very prevalent, especially in foster care. As an advocate and stuff, children who've been in foster care have been subjected to really humongous corners. Now, they're not necessarily in institutes, but where the foster care system has failed them because they aren't with families who nurture and provide to them. It's also adverse child experience. And there was a point with the deaf community, with certain deaf schools that were not being watched, not in Alabama, but other states. Those deaf people experienced adverse childhood experiences because they were deprived of their language. They were deprived of services. So they didn't have language by the time they graduated. So this is something I like to talk about. Institutes is just keep in mind, thinking about as an advocate, especially become and work as a juvenile court advocate. Anybody familiar with that? Okay, yeah. you have to really think about the adverse childhood experiences. All right, so I like the words costly freedom because the reality is this freedom or this free labor they were getting came at extreme cost, especially with people with disabilities. So if you were a successful pupil, which means you have a mild disability because you were able to contribute a lot, but you weren't welcome back to the community because remember, at this point, we had the whole warning out of communities. So really, there was no safe place for a person with disability, even if they had mild disability, to really return back because they were perceived as mentally insane or dangerous or a menace to their community. So the superintendents basically decided to keep them and transition their training skills into skills that was work to make the pupils more productive workers. So the institutions started priding themselves on how efficient they can make the workers, which is where a lot of the idea of factory efficiency came from. And while I want to point here, Dr. Hine, Dr. Sine, both, once they realized what was happening at bigger institutes that they did not have control over, and they tried to speak it out, and it was too late essentially at this point. And they realized, and just their advocacy was pretty much ignored. And this is one of his speeches that he gave on institutions at this point when they realized it was too late and what was actually going on inside of these institutes. But instead of first carefully inquiring whether an institution is absolutely necessary, that is, whether there is no more natural and effectual manner of relieving the class, and afterwards taking care of that no vicious principle to be incorporated into the establishment, they hastily built a great showy building and fathered within its wall a crowd of persons of like condition of infirmity and organized the community where everything goes by clockwork and steam. And this is referring to what he was saying of the force and labor force of these institutions. And we take it a step further. So we have working institutions, and then we started to see medicalization of these institutes because the medical model. So what's important to know about this, the Medical Association at the time, which is now the American Association for Mental Retardation, is that still the correct name today? I'm trying to remember history-wise. Yeah, I think so, AAMA or. But the original Medical Association was formed by 6 superintendents who had these institutions, and they came together and they wanted to figure out if they could use these institutions as a source of research to discuss the causes, conditions, statistics of idiots, the management training and education of idiots and feeble-minded persons. It will also lend its influence to the establishment and fostering of institutions for this purpose. And that was the purpose of this medical association at the time, which eventually became the American Association for Mental Retardation. So the perspective shift went from people who with disabilities were being used as workers to people with disabilities were viewed as patients who were sick and needed to be cured. And the individual was redefined to meet the needs of the institution, basically, ultimately at harm. So I like to use the word colonization within borders. So the superintendents, especially these superintendents of the Medical Association, believed that different disabilities should be placed in different quarters. So you didn't have just people with disabilities going within institutions. You started having people, and these institutions got bigger because they got more funding to conduct their research and basically started segregating people to different quarters. So you have Black people in one quarter, you have women in another quarter, you have people with mental insanity in another quarter. You get the idea to conduct everything. Go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I just looked that up, the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, but it had several other names before that. But...
Yeah. So, yeah. The reference for Medical Association, last one is from Colin Hicks' presentation and Minnesota Governor, that the Medical Association that was formed there was the one that became the American Association for Mental Retardation. So, which I believe I touched on tomorrow. It changed names again, but I have to look back. So, you know, history, lots of names change. So, all right. So colonization of borders, so we start to see a lot more harmful ableism because society considered people as disabilities as a burden at this point, and they had justification between the institutes and census data as well. Because by this point, the US Census was counting people with disabilities under the same category as social problems. So people who were committing crime, prostitution, were alcoholics, and all that stuff as well. And the US Census basically came to conclude that many people with feeble-mindedness were living in communities. Parents wanted help and relief for their children. Institutions wanted to expand their facilities. So we get into that battle of parents thought they were doing what was right for their child, or there's a lot of shame going on, their child has a disability, so the demand rise that their child goes somewhere. And these institutes were rising, and was very interesting to me to look at. I looked later at what institutions were charging parents, and I compared it to US dollars, so we'll get to that. But of course, we know when something gets bigger, you're understaffed and overcrowded, your conditions start automatically get worse. So that's what ultimately happened. The number of public institutions, this is data, in 1880, there was about 250 people per institution. And by 1905, which is only 15 years, there were 500 per institution. And then the number of private institutes also rose as well. In 1900, there was 10, and by 1923, there were 80 total. And what's really important, we gotta remember in terms of history at this point, in 1923, this is known as the Roaring '20s. So this is before the Great Depression. Yeah, so it's important. And the attitudes are different. So people with disabilities were no longer seen as people, but rather scapegoats because they're different. So often a lot of people, there were laws, and especially community laws, created during this time to try to force people with disabilities, because they're in men's society, they were the reason for alcoholism, different stuff, to be in these institutes. So this is the trigger warning because we're about to get into eugenics. But before we do that, why don't we go ahead and break so that way y'all can go ahead and check in. And my eugenics part is a little bit shorter. And we have some like good humor memes at the end of it. And then we'll keep going. All right. All right. So we're getting rolling. I hope you appreciate the trigger warning because we're going to talk about eugenics. And before we get started, are people familiar with what we mean when we say the word eugenics? Okay. Yeah. So the idea of the study that we're going to make better humans, which has a lot of history of genocide. So anything you elaborate on that? No. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about the rise of eugenics in the 19th century. So because it's triggering history, it's not me trying to breeze through it, but we're aware of it. And I want to just focus and hit on in points and for reasons why the rise of eugenics in the United States was so dominant. And what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the history of eugenics is actually started in the US more. If you look at overall compared to the world. People did, I mean, it was everywhere, but you can make the argument that we practice it the most in generally. But then again, this is me looking through the lens of, as I'm looking for history and everything, you know, so not biasing, but I'm gonna acknowledge that. That makes sense. Like this is me taking my research, what I found. So, all right. So in the 1890s, there was a large surge of Eastern European immigrants to the US. And what happened with this is back when you remember the guy he talked about the return investment as economicness from Britain. He was also concerned about the whole bigger population, less resources to accommodate for the population. So there was an economy crisis and the sense of a lot of people got scared of the number of immigrants coming in, and there's a lack of jobs because there's more people. So competition for everything in terms of economy. All right, and then in 1893, Walter Fernald, the president of the American Association on Mental Deficiency, which is not the same association as the American Association of Mental Retardation, which I checked that because I was like, wait, same thing? No, two different organizations. So anyways, he's saying that institutional care was economic and conservative. So we have a money problem. We have a lot of people coming in. We have a money problem. He proposed a solution that institutional care is economic and conservative. So it led to financial justification of building more institutes and the annual cost of residence being between $550 to $200 per month. This is from parents, which was equivalent to $3,500 today, if you want to compare. So that was what they were charging to keep a person, especially a child with disability in these institutes, was around $3,500 today per month. In 1990, 1 in 7 Americans was foreign-born, which is really important to think about this because we're still going through civil rights by this point. We haven't hit the civil rights movement yet, but you can trace a lot of the threads with civil rights and everything through this as well. In 1913, the US Public Health administered the newly invented Bennett IQ test at Ellis Island to immigrants. And we'll talk a bit more about the Bennett IQ test specifically, like who developed them and that stuff. Well, it's really important to realize with US history of immigration and everything is they intentionally used the Bennett IQ test, which was never challenged for its validity, as a reason to try to take someone who immigrated here straight into the institution because they were automatically feeble-minded based on the assessment. So people are coming in thinking they could have a chance for the American dream just to then be institutionalized right away. So it was recorded by this point with documentation stuff that 79% of Italians, 80% Hungarians, and 83% Jews, and 87% of Russians were feeble-minded. I had a difficult time finding data on Black people and people of color, but I like to say a lot of data has been buried because people did not want to track them for a while because they were automatically, So the validity of the test, being the Bennett test, was unchallenged, so the test results were used as propaganda to reinforce negative images of immigrants, that immigrants were troublesome, they were a threat to the economy of the United States and everything. So, all right, so key ideas with the eugenics, and this is, I'm just gonna kind of highlight here, but we have to understand with eugenics history, we have to understand the key philosophies at the time. And one of the key philosophies at the turn of the 19th century was xenophobic hysteria, which is basically the government supported actions that excluded and segregated Black people, people of color, and other racial minorities due to economic threat. And this hysteria and propaganda led to a lot of hysteria. People were afraid that their wealth was going to get stolen, stuff like that. That's what I mean by xenophobic hysteria. This negatively impacted people with disabilities because people with disabilities at this point were still viewed as menace and a burden to society. So, and if you are a Black disabled person, you've got a double to triple whammy, all that stuff. So late 19th into 20th century was when the eugenic movements truly started. So we have to understand, in a way, people conclude that the xenophobic hysteria fuels the eugenics movement in a sense. So the eugenics movement basically advocated the science of improvement of the human race by better breeding. And there was heavy advocacy by doctors for sterilization of people with disabilities, especially because they would eventually ruin the human species. Because at the time, there was they were trying to justify using the US Census data. You know, they were grouping people with mental retardation into crime and everything. That data was increasing. So they were trying to use the increasing data on the US Census to justify their need to sterilize people with disability and sterilize people of other color as well as all that. So you have to look at that. Social Darwinism, so I want to differentiate. So Darwinism is more about the evolution and everything, like how we evolve as humans over time. Social Darwinism is pulled from Charles Darwin, but not himself. It was a group of different philosophers, but social Darwinism looks more at the evolution of biological species named by a process of natural selection, also governed the affairs of society and social evolution. So that's how it differs. Evolution is just more looking at the science of how people evolve. Social Darwinism is looking more about how the evolution affects social and societal pieces. So, but this belief enforced the need for sterilization, marriage restrictions, and warehousing of people with disabilities in institutions, and also it is the reason for laws for preventing intermarriage between Black people and people of color with white people. It also justified that too. And it led to compulsory, at the time, there was also laws put in place that you were required to attend public school. At this point, parents had the right to choose how they would school their children and stuff, whether it was like homeschool or church groups or public schools. And the US by this point had turned and made it legal. You had to start attending public schools, which is interesting, considering that schools were still segregated and everything, and there were a lack of schools. Anyways, So, but this ultimately did lead, like when you look at the history, so SPED stands for special education. Some people know that, some people don't use that acronym. So just to be quick for time, I just say SP. But when you trace the history of how SPD classrooms started and everything, you can trace it back to the eugenics movement. All right. So words from eugenics that were very commonly used for disabled people, especially. One of the big terms was moral imbecility. And this term was used to label people who may have juvenile insanity, moral insanity, physical epilepsy, and moral paranoia as defective delinquents. And this led to the category of moron under Dr. Henry Goddard, who basically adapted Binet IQ's test. Other words that were used were dangerous in society. You can see this like if you type in people with disabilities, propaganda of eugenics movement, you will see the number of forms and different paper and pamphlets created about how people with disabilities were a dangerous menace to society. And then people with mental retardation and mental illness were the causes of poverty, drunkenness, prostitution, and everything else. And this framework was used to segregate and sterilize people who were labeled this so that the gene pool would not be destroyed. And this is a quote from, we'll get to him. All right, Dr. Goddard himself. Okay, so the Kallick family. So I have intentionally, with the history of eugenics, I'm not posting a lot of photos in the slide because they're very triggering. I am going to show photos of Germany eventually, but just the memorial site and just one of the hospitals because we're talking about it that way. So I just want to let people know. But if you want to look up who the Kallick family is, you can Google Deborah Kallick herself. Kallick was her fake last name. They, in Latin, Kallick means good and bad. So that's how they developed the name for her last name for the study. But anyways, he took this woman who lived in their institution, which was the Vineland Training School. And Dr. Henry Goddard traced her family line all the way down and stated that her great-great-great-grandfather had relations with a feeble-minded barmaid that resulted in a child. And she's in an institution for feeble mind by this point. So he was trying to justify why is this woman in an institution? And it must be because of her great-great-great-grandfather had this child. But what's ironic is she came from a wealthy family, and we'll get to that in a minute. So this three G's, main greats, this three greats grandfather then moved to Philadelphia after he had these relations with the barmaid, did not seem to know that the barmaid had a child, I don't know, where he married a woman of the upper class. That led to a family of outstanding individuals of normal or better intelligence. And he hypothesized that the child at this barmaid created multiple generations of people who were feeble-minded, prostitute, alcoholics, people with epilepsy, and criminals. While the other family led to people who were outstanding citizens, wealthy, productive, all this stuff, based on this one woman who was living in the institution and was subjected to the institution's trauma. So he basically staked his claim that mental retardation was hereditary and the root cause of many problems. Dr. Goddard's research added an additional fuel, as I like to call, the fire that people with disabilities were moral medicines. Due to demand and overcrowding of institutes, parole also started with higher functioning individuals to make room. So if you want to know about the history of parole, it also started with people with disabilities and the whole race as well. Because they were trying to solve a problem with the institutes, they started finding people who were higher functioning to try to get them back in society. But let's look at the cycle of money and everything. So, but the thing that we have to really think about this is these high functioning individuals, because they were worried about the gene pool being watered down, they were sterilized before they were released back into the community. And this is forced sterilization here. So Buck versus Bell, 1927, is actually a case. Bell is a woman who was forcefully sterilized. She was an inmate at an institution, was forcefully sterilized before she went back, and she sued. This case was never overruled. The case ruled in favor of forced sterilization. So let that sink in a minute. Laws are still present today that a doctor can sterilize a disabled person without their consent. And when I went back and looked at the laws and stuff, just to see the history of where it is, the laws are still in writing, even though they may not be done. But do we really know? I don't know. Georgia is one of them. You want to know, state of Georgia. All right, so so these are names throughout history. So when we trace history, these are what you could consider big people who, and then this is not exhaustive list, so just so you know that. There are additional people in this list as well, but for the sake of timing and everything, these are the ones I chose hit with, and these were referred in Colin Hicks' presentation, which I thought was pretty thorough for me. But one of the things that people don't realize, so remember, Aristotle's, the Greek philosopher, when we talked about Greek culture, he was the one who believed that there should be a law in place that any child who was deformed should be killed right away. And that's eugenics philosophy right there. Charles Darwin, he talked about evolution, and the idea behind evolution was like, how can genetics be manipulated, but not necessarily how can genetics be manipulated to make a better gene pool at the time, just like there's natural selection, so there's gonna be a natural gene pool. But it was Dr. Hubert Spencer who really ran with the survival of the fittest. So in the survival of the fittest, we gotta wean out the gene pool. You follow me? All right, and Alfred Bennett is the guy who created the Bennett IQ test based on a bunch of research and stuff, and you could definitely look that up in your own time. But he's the reason for categorizing based on presentation, questions they answer, and knowledge super type things, which we know the Bennett test is still used today in some places. And I have to look, remind me, when was the Bennett test ever overturned? I was trying to remember that. I think it's still being used today. There's different versions of it. But Alfred Bennett created the IQ test, but it was Goddard who used the Bennett test to find moral implicity, which was a whole research. And then he turned around and did the Clark family study. And if you look up the Clark family study, you will find massive propaganda. And literally the picture is this, it's her in the middle and behind, or it's a picture of her great grandfather. And behind is this cloud of all these well outstanding citizens. And the other cloud is all the imbeciles. And they literally use that as in a way of, and basically the message with that graphic was choose wisely who you marry, which I thought was really interesting. So, which you should choose wisely who you marry, but not for that reason. All right, and then we know World War II, we had a huge genocide for people with disabilities, but we had a huge genocide of just people of several races, including Black people, and we'll hit that too. Dr. Peter Singer was a physician here in 2015, who promoted public policy that would legalize the killing infants with severe disabilities, because he believed that there should be a right that any infant who was born that has severe disability should automatically be euthanized. And this was 2015. And then Dr. Jack Kerbo is an American pathologist and euthanasis proponent who claimed to assist 130 patients in medical suicide. And somebody did investigative journalism on him. They autopsied 69 of his cases and found that 75%, so 3/4 of his cases, of these people who claimed had wanted medical suicide and wanted to be assisted at, they were actually not terminally ill. And that is something that is a current issue. When I did some research, there is still massive concerns about medical assisted suicide and people potentially using that in order to potentially kill people with disabilities today. That is a current prevalent issue actually right now in the United States, which is fascinating. So eugenics present day. This is the reference, and this is even internationally. So things that we still today, so I told you, sterilization, marriage laws are still in place that limit people with disability from marrying their partner without severe consequence. So, sorry, I'm gonna have 2 points. But we still have some sterilization laws today, even though they're not enforced. But people can make an argument for when you look at the history of Roe versus Wade, not necessarily on abortion, but one of the reasons it was overturned was because people believed it was a sterilization in a sense. So that stuff was just really interesting. But Buck versus Bell has never been overturned as well. And certain states still have sterilization laws today, even if they're not being used. Marriage, there are still laws in place that prevent people with disabilities from marrying their partner without severe systematic consequence. And I think this is what you were hitting earlier. People are afraid to marry or even to have a joint account because they're afraid of losing their benefits. I have a couple friends who just tell each other they're married in the eyes of God, but they are not legally married because they are afraid of losing their benefits and healthcare and all that stuff is a still present day issue. Parenting, it was eventually recognized as a right for people with disabilities to be able to parent their own children in some court cases, but a couple cases that set, for instance, SAC 1991 versus 1991. That's what the references I got here. But the idea is, if you're a parent who is disabled, that has a child who is able, it can be overridden that you can no longer parent that child on the grounds of health or safety of the child. And I see this still today. I have a couple good friends. One recently, she is a spinal cord injury. And one of the biggest things that she found out when she had a healthy baby girl and everything, people try to use her social media as documentation and try to call Child Protective Services on her because they believe that she should not be able to raise because like, oh, she's gonna drop the baby, she's gonna kill the baby, she's gonna run over the baby for a wheelchair. That's still going on today. And then medicine, we are also seeing current technology existing to eliminate undesirable human characteristics. There is some people that figured out it's not hard, but it's called gene therapy. And the idea is if you are going through IFV and different stuff, you can manipulate your genes of which embryos you want. That's like the extremist side. That makes sense. I always dig that because it's kind of questionable science. Like, can you really manipulate genes or not? But there has been discussion of manipulating embryos as part of the fertility process to make it more desirable. President Steps, yeah, go ahead.
Said Jim Wilson, Huntsville, Alabama. And you were speaking, I was thinking of.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No worries. Sorry, June Wilson, Huntsville, Alabama. I was thinking IVF because my child is an IVF kiddo, and throughout that process, we were given the option of what they call PGS testing. So you test your embryos, and if there are embryos that they would consider defective, then you can terminate those embryos. It is a choice. We, of course, opted not to have our embryos PGS tested because I wanted God to do whatever he was going to do. And he did. And so we're here. But that is definitely, I mean, it's very big. And there's, of course, depending on where you are in your IVF journey, there's a lot of, there's some of us that are, for it and some that aren't. And then some of us that are in the middle, we get both sides of it, but, naturally you choose what you want. But we actually chose not to have that, not to have the testing. Yeah. Because of that, because I was thinking, I mean, because it could be something as small as a child maybe having they went so in depth to like cleft foot. I mean, like something that down to autism that for me, right, exactly, but they would certain testing they would do, they could say, well, this could potentially lead to, and then so of course naturally you're like, well, I want this perfect baby. So why would I, and so to not even be put into that situation, we just eliminated to even have that.
That's why when I was reading, that's what referring to choosing gene therapy within fertility and different stuff. And that may depend on clinic to clinic. Some professionals warn heavily against it. It's just not be an option that to genetically test because it just, for the exact reason you said there. It's selection. And then assisted suicide is the other thing I hit on is there's been a lot of discussion. And it actually stems a little bit from, I don't know how much you're going into this or not with independent living and stuff, but the idea that nursing homes are overcrowded. So there needs to be assisted suicide to start winding down the population. And that's like the radical eugenics, like things I read in terms of theories and stuff, nothing really in law, but I have seen some suggestions of it. And if we think about one of the things that people don't realize, so I was a physical therapist, like I share pelvic floor mainly, but before that, I worked at Encompass Lakeshore Rehab. And one of the things that people don't realize is if your rehab runs out of beds, your rehab can be done in a nursing home in certain places, or your discharge will be to a nursing home. So we got to think about that. If you are a person who now has a new disability because of traumatic brain injury or stroke or spinal cord injury and your family doesn't have what they need to go home, you get sent to a nursing home. And it's so hard. Like I try to work through and help families find the right nursing homes and everything. Yeah, you're nodding your head. Yeah. Yeah. Because you're not going to be guaranteed that you will get your continued therapy there. So we also got to consider that. So there's been discussion and I need to go find the stories and stuff, but I've heard between social media, different stuff, the stories of people with spinal cord injury who ends up not getting care for their homes that end up dying in nursing homes. And some people question is, were they actually medically assassinated sometimes? So that's eugenics in a sense. Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, with your experience over at Encompass, but, one thing that, some of us in the room might remember the days. There may not be too many of us who remember the days when somebody going through rehab, and I know people, who had gone through rehab, particularly people with spinal cord injuries, higher level spinal cord injuries, would stay in rehab hospitals really for a lengthy period of time, anywhere from 6 months to a year. Where they can, whereas now you're out of the hospital, and and anybody here work in a hospital or rehab unit, but probably out, what?
It's rehab, but it's a nursing home, but a lot of people are really there just for rehab. They don't have any more room in the.
Yeah. So these days, I mean, you may be in there for what, maybe a month to 6 weeks. But, and so there are probably some advantages and disadvantages to both, but the fact that one thing that I think you do see, at least amongst a certain generation, is that there were a lot of personal relationships that developed, during that period of 6 months to a year, a lot of what we call peer support. And so people really got to, in fact, I know somebody who is and we can talk about this individual later, but somebody actually met their wife, who was actually on staff at this, at the hospital or nursing home that he was in. And so as he was going, what's that? Yeah, so. No, well, I'm not sure what happened. Actually, she was a physical therapist as well. And so, so physical, there's a lot of, hands-on work with physical therapists. But anyway, they just, they just really, it was a really great match.
That way, like, someone usually nursing home, you'll get better care as a family member as well.
See, sometimes, so. But yes, there's been discussions of medical suicide, assisted suicide. So this is a physician to the UNA Council on this in 2020, which is interesting because it's when COVID started. It's when this conversation started too. If assisted dying is made available for persons with health conditions or impairments, but who are not terminally ill, a social assumption could be made that it's better to be dead than to live with disability. And we all know that we still see this attitude very prevalent. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Let's get.
It's Renee. Yeah, it is. So I am a nurse practitioner at a children's hospital here in Alabama, but I do a lot of time in the neonatal intensive care unit, and I still have new fellows that come out of fellowship as a physician. So they're like early 30s that I have to make this argument with still today, that because the baby has a brain bleed, they feel like we should not offer life-sustaining care. And it's a battle regularly, honestly. And with my older doctors, I've gotten used to that. I mean, they're in their 70s. And so when they were in fellowship, this is what you did, right? But with a 34-year-old, that it's not even a cultural issue. This is where they were born, where they were raised. And they strongly believe that it's a drain on the medical system and that the child would have a, miserable quality of life because they weren't walking, talking with a high IQ.
Back to able perspectives on what is normal. And that views a lot of eugenics. So I think we got another comment here. So wait for a minute.
Also a comment online.
This is Ashley. I was just going back to the Bennett test that you were talking about, and you had a question about it. I had a test on this. The new WASI, the Washington test and the Welshers test has now taken those, but they're very out of date. They haven't even been updated since 2003. So they're testing our students going into transitional phase from out of middle school, high school into the employment workforce, and they're using a very out-of-date test. And in some countries now, especially South Africa, they'll use that test to say, okay, you're going to be institutionalized, and they still sterilize there in some certain parts.
And thank you, because I know your PIPA cohort, I know there was someone that presented on the Bennett test and the update as well. And I'm also a member of what is known as COPA, which I found out you were too. And COPA did hit on, we have several parent advocates who are, their child has intellectual disability, and the movement of the Bennett test into what is the test today has been massive as well. But still, go ahead.
We have Tegan Frazier online. I also did not get the genetic testing done even when I was classified as early advanced maternal age. She says, I will say that the facility at Yale is wonderful. I had an aunt who stayed at a rehabilitation center over a year. Then she comments, yes, antiquated system of testing.
The next present day. Scary to think about. So the brutal truth that we have to discuss and acknowledge American history. The Nazis traveled to the US to learn about US's research in eugenics, which helped justify Nazi genocide. They specifically went to the California eugenics program, to be honest, but they actually came in and they went to different programs across the country to learn what we're doing. Though we were not necessarily euthanizing people the way they did, they looked at the research and the ideologies behind X and basically highlighted that more. So this is a hospital. As you know, we know all the camps and different stuff as well, but what's specific about this hospital, and I apologize, my notes are underneath for this one. So I have the right name. Okay, this is Harmer Hospital in Germany. This is specifically the hospital that was actually a hospital for people with disabilities that became one of the first hospitals that killed most of the disability before World War II started. So people have to remember with history, and it was hard to listen to my great-grandmother. She lived to be 102. She passed away when I was about 12 years old. But I remember her talking about what people in America, because I remember her like drilling it into my head as a young child, and my sister said the same thing. People in American history forget the history of how the Nazis made everything look seamless, like it was okay society with propaganda stuff. It wasn't like this boom movement and we're killing all these people. It was slowly over time. They were planting ideas in the mind of people that there needs to be a perfect race, that people with disabilities were menaces, people who were Black were menaces, people who were Jewish were menaces to society. And it was just a slow thing over time. But what people didn't realize, and she lived actually in the country, Germany, so she survived both World War I and World War II. And she said when World War I happened the first time, she was leaving the country and she didn't find out until soldiers came to her house to take her house. And that was 8 months after the war started. Like people in Germany actually had no idea what was going on in the urban cities. And she saw the same things happen in World War II as well. But Germany just had a lot more speech and stuff. And they integrated Nazi propaganda into their textbooks today, which is why a lot of people have accused the United States of lately of manipulating history. Not that we are the new Nazi era, but people have concerns. And it's very interesting arguments if you start thinking about like the philosophies and everything with that. But that's been one of the big pushbacks I've seen with people who are advocates that the DEI movement being shut down right now, that they feel like it's similar to what Hitler did with the Nazism in Germany. So not saying it is, but it's an interesting food for the thought, you know. But this is Harmer Hospital, which is was an institution, became a hospital in Germany, but 10,000 people with disabilities were killed at this hospital specifically. And I'm going to read the rest of the set. So we know the Holocaust, we know the Holocaust and the killing of 6 million Jews, Poles, Romanian Gypsies, and other groups by Nazi. What is less commonly known is that one of the earliest populations Nazis set out to destroy were people with disabilities. 100,000 children and adults with mental and physical disabilities were exterminated. Some who managed to live were subjected to inhuman and unconscious medical experiments. I can see the doctor right now because I watched the documentary. I did not include in this presentation, but there was a doctor in Germany. He liked to take twins, but he took the twins that were disabled, and he conducted a series of ton of medical experiments on them because he was trying to find the twin link. So that's just an example of where people with disabilities were exploited. And even he took normal twins that were healthy too, especially Jewish twins. So what people do not realize, so T4 is the infamous program that started a lot of the euthanization. It was actually based on the science of the California eugenics program. So T4 was basically one of the beginning programs for the camps and everything. And today in Germany, they have taken this. So the German word is Tiergarten Straße 4, and this is Berlin, Germany. So T4 for short. And this is one of the first programs where they started to kill lots of people of different races at this point, not people with disabilities at this point, but this is where the creation of T4, people argue, is when it started World War II, because people realized when this program had been created and mass genocide of people, it basically led to United Nations threatening and all that stuff. And so today Germans recognize their traumatic history and their harmful history as well. So it's a memorial in honor of all the people who were killed in the T4 program. So now it's across the whole spectrum and include disabled people too. So, and that was basically the lethal injection. So I don't know how many people have watched the news this week. What happened in Alabama yesterday? Yeah. So, which is interesting. So it was interesting the amount of protesting I saw, even though he's a criminal, but it was interesting the protesting. Man on Alabama's death row was killed with nitrogen gas yesterday, which was really interesting, just reading the medical opinions and people who were speaking out on the type of lethal killing method they were doing. So it's going to be really interesting, I think, over time to see how that all evolves out, especially Eli Equal Justice Institute was, I mean, of course, they're a huge defendant and they try to protect all people on death row. But it's been really interesting to watch the news. But in a sense, you can argue that is a method of eugenics, is the idea of lethal injections and use of gas on death row. So, all right, humor break. So these are some of my favorite memes. All right, I like this one. So, wind blowing, deaf people. And this is one of my favorite ones. Which actually happened to me. So the humor break is gonna be this. I think my favorite story was, it was about two where talk about people want to pray over you because they want to heal, but they can pray for alleviating of your suffering, peace, and different stuff. It makes sense. The same thing happened to me. I was physical therapist for a bit. So my patients, when they realized I had hearing loss and deafness both, I will never forget this one patient where we were just talking a little bit. I'm treating her. I've gotten to know her a little bit, like well-intended. And she goes, I was sharing a little bit about my story, just with some things that I had experienced as a child. And I even had this happen with a guy that I had dated before my husband. And I just remember both going like, oh, my mom has hearing loss, so I completely understand it. So good intents, poorly done. Because my point with this is, I'm a big believer. I don't understand the experiences my same friends are deaf. Like we have all been through the ringer on different ways. Just as my friends are autistic, can't understand experiences of another person who's autistic. But it was just funny to me coming from other people. Oh, like my grandma has hearing loss, so I completely understand. And we know that kind of hurts a little bit. So anyways, I just thought this picture was funny because I'm like, yep, that's definitely happens on a regular. So let's continue. So we're back with institution history. So we took a break, talked about eugenics because it applies to the history of institutions. So this is where the rise of special education starts with. And what people don't realize is special education has a big history in institutions as well. So remember the institutions at one point, they were supposed to provide training, provide academics, so we can make the argument that special education started in a sense there, even though it was segregated facilities and different stuff. But then institutions' demand for people needing to be in the institutions grow, we know quality went down. So there was a loss on academics, emphasis and everything. But there were some institutions with good intent. So for example, some of the schools for the deaf were known as institutions, but they were big driven on language acquisition and different stuff. So they kind of remain academic and all of this to an extent, and the schools for the blind especially. But if you have physical disability, mental disability, or intellectual disability, usually you're the scapegoat. So again, we remember early Roman Empire history, preference for certain disabilities are better. I absolutely acknowledge that people view it would be better to be deaf and blind than to be any other type of disability, and that is, I have no words for that. So the minutes theme that people are in minutes society was still prevalent, even in the earliest special education classrooms. So the almost is a reference to a book that portrayed the message that people with mental disabilities are almost human. And at this time as well, and this is around the 1890s into early 90s, like mid 90s at this point, because we're getting towards 50s at this point. Families were still shamed for having children with mental disabilities, leading to increased institutionalization and hiding of their children. It was common practice with medical professionals, if they realized the child had a disability, to tell the parent to give up their child and to try again to have a healthy child. That was common practice. So a lot of these children end up in institutions as well, or orphanages that became institutions. So in 1923, 34,000 students, that should be thousands, sorry, 34,000 students were in special education classrooms at this point. So the reason I say hope for SPD, we'll explain that. All right. So by this point in history, this is 1920s to 1950s, there was one state support institution in every state. And the number of residents increased from 25,000 to 50,000 residents in these state institutions. And at peak of like the growth of the institution, public institutions housed 4% of all people with mental disabilities, but consumed the vast majority of public funding for services. These institutions were still custodial care. So that's the point I'm trying to make. Where's the money going? Because these public institutions were funded, very publicly heavy, and there's proof that they were consuming all their funding for services, but they were still receiving custodial care. By 1920, superintendents started to see positive results of education and community interaction with people with disabilities. So despite the fact that Goddard really dominated the beliefs that, you know, people with disabilities should be sterilized, should be in prison, should not dilute the gene pool, a couple of superintendents started trying to incorporate a bit more life skills back into these institutions. And that's where the hope for SPP started, because there was starting to be a trend away from the eugenics movement. Be like, okay, if we start teaching people some academics life skills, like, is there hope for them? And that's why I mean by hope question mark. And this was a time where IQ scores were challenged. So that's why I mean by hope, because some people started to question the validity and started challenging these IQ tests, because they're like, okay, we've been told these IQ tests mean that people are not capable of anything, but this test is not really valid, like how we challenge this. So this was also a time that a couple superintendents, they were just not named, were starting to challenge the idea that Dr. Goddard had, that people with disabilities were worthless. So IQ tests, of course, we know were a permanent label for people with disabilities, well, especially intellectual disabilities, mental disabilities. Families at this time, so remember 1920s to 1950s is Great Depression era. So at this time, families were unable to financially provide for their children with disabilities, nor find educational services for them. And we're about to get into the reawakening movement. So remember, we're still in institution history. So at this point, parents believed there was no hope for them. Like, they could not find things for their child. Like, people were in desperate situations, especially in the Great Depression era too. So the Great Depression was costly, 1929 to 1939. Special education classes were only in urban cities. So if you lived in the country, there was no hope for you. You usually were sending your child in by that point to the urban city to have hope that there was special training at this point for your child. So families sent their children to institutions, and they would pay a small fee and stuff, but they hoped it was a better opportunity. But to summarize this time period, there was still a lack of community services, negative attitudes about persons with disabilities that result in an increased demand for institution placement, because people were still being subjected to confinement laws as well at this point. So prison, jail, all that. All right. One of the reasons that institutions also went really downhill during this era was World War II, because we had the draft. If you got drafted, you had to go. You had no choice. You had to go. So due to the draft, what people don't realize is many attendance of public institutions, even though they were well-funded, the ones that ran better than other ones, the ones that ran better eventually turned into custodial care because they didn't have enough people. They were understaffed. So again, increased demand, quality's going down because they don't have people. We don't have staffing. We see some of the same things today still, you know? So shortage of staff would continue to increase demand and admission to institutions. So the reason I put, don't forget about those who made it home. A lot of people who made it home all had disability post-war, if we really think about it, because let's talk about traumatic stress, like PTSD, and our veterans that made it home often end up in institutions. And we still see that today. Veterans don't get care in this country, and a lot of them end up in, yeah. So, and then it was at this point that some institutions actually started charging a little bit of money for people to view people with disabilities. I caught a little bit of that, a little bit, yeah, just a little bit, not as much as before. But conscientious objectors relate to, this was a movement by the United States. They were trying to get people, so conscientious objectors relates to public institutions to try to recruit staff. So these conscientious objectors went into institutions because they realized there were staff shortages and everything, and then they got in and they realized how horrible the conditions were. And these conscientious objectors end up trying to speak out about what was actually happening at the institution. So that's what it's referring to. There was a rise of conscientious objectors, which you can make the argument these were some of the first advocates against institutions as well on that, because they were witnessing it. So they're whistleblowers. All right. We're going to discuss Willowbrook State School, New York, a little bit later today because of the timelines of the next movement. Willowbrook State School, New York is a massive institution with very dark history, but a lot of the whistleblowing that happened to it happened more in the reawakening movement. So I just want to let the people know that, because some people think about, Willowbrook was a massive institution, but we are going to discuss that one. So do you have anything to add institution history? Because I know independent living, or we get to talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah. We'll talk about it tomorrow.
Okay. All right. So reawakening movement is 1950 to 1980. Man, give me a second. All right. I'm talking a lot. All right. So the reawakening movement, ultimately, there's some argument. The reawakening movement is when people with disabilities started to awake and realize that there could be more for them, but it started with the parents. So there's the argument that the reawakening movement is the same as the parent movement for disability. So just know that's kind of the difference between the two, because tomorrow I'll cover the history of self-advocacy, which is where really people who were disabled or had disabilities themselves were now the primary advocates over their parents. That makes sense. But right now, this movement is more focused on what parents were trying to do to advocate for their children, which is really cool history. So that's the difference between the reawakening movement and the self-advocacy movement. So if you want to know, the reawakening movement is considered 1950 to 1980. Some people argue that the self-advocacy movement starts 1980 and beyond. You're gonna find my presentation tomorrow. I kind of find it starts more 1960. And you gotta think about timelines, you know, civil rights and everything. People want to view things in history in like one timeline. We gotta think about, it's just like Marvel, there's multiple universes, multiple timelines together. So, all right, so the parents' movement, as you see, 1947 to 1980, which is considered part of the reawakening movement. So post-World War II, parents began to organize and advocate in grassroots efforts over poor living conditions and institutions, a lack of community services for disabled children. The first national movement why was the retarded can be helped. And this is the stamp that they had. They used it. They tried to get funding and stuff to get themselves going because they were trying to advocate and create and basically the idea. So what I read, especially with this group, they basically were trying to pull their children out of the institute, but let's also follow the money. These were also wealthy families who had the opportunity to. They were basically trying to bring their children home and try to start their mini online training schools to show that it can be done. Like if you give a child what they need, you give the child more opportunities. That makes sense. But they were trying to advocate this is what institutions need to be doing. So kind of interesting, you know. In the 1960s to 1970s, obviously by parents for improved conditions, state institutions creating community services, educational employment opportunity initiation, legislation, and challenging perspectives of society on disability. So what you have to understand is the reason I put that point there is because more 1940s and 1960s, children with disabilities went back to the perspective that children with disabilities were children of the eternal God. So it was a bit safer type of movement. So good intents, that makes sense, but just that was protected time. And then versus in the 1960s and 1970s is when we start seeing the ball really rolling that people with disabilities are people. So, and we'll get into that tomorrow because it's really 1980s when we start seeing a bit of that more. So, all right. Okay, so we're going to talk about some key figures in this movement. President John F. Kennedy was considered a notable figure of the Rude Awakening because people forget that his sister Eunice had a disability herself, intellectual disability. So he was the president responsible for launching the presidential panel on mental retardation and develop a plan to combat mental retardation. So, and he actually helped give the ability for parent organizations to be able to file lawsuits and for states to recognize civil rights and legal rights for their children with just some of the things that he passed, assassinated, and the next president who took him, helped him. So this was an era where we started seeing legislation change things that were suggested, and we'll see that on the timeline because I do have that. All right, parent groups. So OG stands for original organizers. Some groups that I like to highlight on OG, yeah, we know it. But I thought it was really cool to go back and look at the name of some of the biggest parent groups, and this is what was kind of listed. But the point I want to make with this, I thought was really cool. By 1950, there were a total 88 parent groups with a membership totaling 19,300 people across 19 states, which I thought was cool. Majority of the states were Northeast coasts, if you want to know. Not as much in the South, but not surprised. So, and what was also interesting about this movement is the Reawakening movement was also about trying to flip the table on the medical model for people with disabilities slowly, bit by bit. But it was interesting because when I started reading about it, and we're going to talk about it in a second. So to start to explain this, the American Association on Mental Deficiency started hosting these annual conventions. And they got together and they realized these parents are really coming out of movement, and they actually are making really great points about how we should care for people with disabilities, because it was back into the idea that people with disabilities were no longer meant to society, but rather we give them compassionate care and stuff. So that's where parents were starting to turn the tables. They were starting to fight, call out institutions and everything, and medical professionals realized, oh yeah, this is going on. We need to give compassionate care to these people. So they started providing, inviting parents to their organization. There was a lot of fear, of course, from the medical community, especially in 1947. That was the first conference. They were brought to try and merge themselves with a parent organization, and a bunch of people protest that the parents are too demanding. I would like to pause for a minute. Raise your hand if you've been victimized, that you're a demanding parent for your child. Yep. So in 1948, part of the agenda for that annual convention was dedicated to parent groups with parent advocates, educating professionals. So this was the first conference. So despite the fear, they still moved forward with the action, and they actually had speakers from different parent groups educating these medical professionals on what the realities of their children with disabilities was really like. So ball started rolling a little bit. In 1949, it was suggested that the parent groups incorporate into the AAMD, and it didn't happen. The president at the time of the American Association on Mental Deficiency, President Mitchell Thomas, refused and did really want to integrate them, but he thought they should just walk alongside with them, which to me is just gaslighting, because it is. 1950, national conferences were held for parent groups by other parent groups by that point. So there was an attempt to join like some of the medical organizations, and it didn't happen. So, all right, Minnesota Governor Luther Youngall. He was the speaker for the very first National Parent Conference in 1950. And the reason I want to highlight him is his speech. So we're just going to read his speech because it is powerful and it's absolutely true. The point is this, ladies and gentlemen, the retarded child is a human being. For reasons for which neither he nor his family are responsible, he is retarded. And I like this because at this point, we're challenging the notions that people with disabilities have a disability because they've done something wrong. Their parents have done something wrong. Their child deserves to have a disability. He has the same rights that children everywhere have. He has the same right to happiness, the same right to play, the right to companionship, the right to be respected, the right to develop to the fullest extent with his capacities, the right to love and affection. We cannot discriminate against this child, deny to this child the rights other children have because of the one thing that neither he nor his family can be helped, because he's retarded. He has a right to these things, and his parents have a right to know that he has his rights. That's my favorite quote. For they too are entitled to peace of mind about what is happening to a retarded child separated from them. Because one of the things that was happening is if their child was in an institution, their parents were kept in the dark of actually what was happening to their child. So the National Association of Parents and Friends of the Retarded Children, which became the ARC. So our ARC is one of the biggest allies, but it was one of the first big parent organizations. It was formed in 1950 at the National Parent Conference, that very first conference. The goal of the organization was to promote the general welfare of mentally retarded of all ages everywhere, at home, in the community, in institutions, and public, private, and religious groups. It registered as a nonprofit in 1953 and renamed as the National Association for Retarded Children and became the ARC in 1992. And what I got last, one of the peak point of their membership was 1977 during the Awakening movement. They had membership totaling 220,936 people at this point. Do we know what this membership is right now or not? No, we'll have to look it up. All right, so organizing, why? So this guy, Wood Hay, was one of the members of the National Association for Retarded Children, which is the ARC. He made this manual, and it's actually awesome because we're talking about my mom was one of the original organizers for the recent newborn hearing screening passed in Alabama, and she read some of these manuals that helped her with her advocacy work, which is pretty cool to me to go back and read, be like, oh yeah, this is the stuff that my mom read to try to figure out how to do grassroots efforts, and I can talk about that. But I like this, and the 2 points that I liked with this was 5 and 6 especially, because when you really think about organizing, you have to address where the money is as well, because everybody's going to fight you tooth and nail about the money and stuff. And that's something you have to really consider important as an advocate is when you're working with legislators and stuff, and it's not that everybody wants money, but we have to recognize the world runs on money. And so you can't be an emotional advocate only. Does that make sense? Like there has to be some recognition. You have to appeal in a sense. And we got to always talk about that later. But I thought it was really cool that part of this parent organization was they started creating manuals and for other parents, other states who were trying to figure out how to organize as well. So, all right. So this was media evidence for people with disabilities. So Pearl's State Book, The Get Earth is a book. And then the other one is a book turned movie. I just need to read my notes on this because I don't want to mess up. So, all right. So what was really important with the reawakening movement at this point, remember, so we just got out of institutional eugenics and everything. We have a bunch of propaganda that people with disabilities are a menace to society, evil and stuff, and that your gene pool is diluted because of people with disabilities. This was some of the first media that put people with disability in a positive lens, according to people with the reawakening movement. So I'm gonna read. These public acknowledgements of children with mental disabilities were unprecedented. Here are two of the most famous women in America at the time, unshamedly telling the world about their daughters and how they loved them. Mental retardation had come out of the closet. It was no coincidence that these books were published at a time when parents of children with mental retardation were beginning to organize. Both Pearl Buck and Dale Evans were in touch with other parents, and both were motivated by a desire to help them. Their books were a tremendous boom to newly organizing parents, emotionally and financially. About $10,000 in royalties from Evan Dale's book supported the first national office at the National Association for Retarded Children in New York. So I thought it was really interesting. Okay, so let's discuss. Yes, you got something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, where I grew up, there actually was I believe their daughter's name was Robin. And where I grew up, there was a school, there was a school or developmental program. I think it was a school they called Robin Roberts. And so that was a relatively small town in the Midwest, but in Ohio. And so I imagine there probably were and I think ultimately it became part of the ARC, the local ARC. And so, so that just shows, the influence that of course, I grew up watching, again, probably not too many of you grew up watching Roy Rogers, but Roy Rogers and Dale Evans every Saturday morning, we'd be watching that, but they really did have quite a extensive influence.
Right, so we're going to discuss this. One of the big reasons that the parent movement happened was because parents were professional about professional neglect. Before we discuss how we win this today, do we know what professional neglect means? Okay, so they define professional neglect is the great example of what I mentioned earlier. A doctor they find out their child has a disability and their doctor saying, you just need to send your child to the institute and they're never gonna make it in life. Like you just gotta expect they're never have their grade, reading level and all that stuff. Okay. That is what we were considering as professional neglect because at this point, even though the medical model is starting to acknowledge that parents have valid experiences and actually do know what they're talking about. Because let's be honest, Mama Bear's gut is pretty much always right. You don't get between Mama Bear and something. I've seen it over. I've witnessed my own mother. For me, people find it, wow, so I was born, like I said, in 1993, but we were told by our ENT, even though they had misdiagnosis, my parents never forgot his words. Your child is deaf. You should just send her to the school for the deaf and expect that she'll not read past a 3rd grade reading level is exactly what my parents were told in Huntsville, Alabama in 1993 when they realized their daughter was deaf. That was the expectation of the ENT here, who's still in practice today, actually. I will not name names, but that's professional neglect. So I want to discuss how do we see this still today in different forms, because not necessarily to pull out trauma and stuff, like you don't have to discuss it, but to recognize that this still happens on different levels today. Like how do perspectives of society, especially the medical model, and it's one of the biggest reasons I'm a huge advocate. I wish all doctor's offices, when you have a child who has a disability, you immediately get referred to counseling. That's one of the things I am a big advocate for is, and it's not necessarily the sense of, so in the deaf community, we talk about we passed the deaf test, and that's good. It makes sense to me on why, but for a hearing parent that is exposed to deaf culture, deaf community, even my mom said she had to walk through with, it's not that I thought something was wrong with you, but I didn't expect this journey. So there is a process of grief, and medical professionals do not recognize that grief often. And if you like to read books on this stuff, one of my favorite books is The Body Keeps Score. Yeah, The Body Keeps Score. But it's really important to recognize as an advocate, when you're in the trenches, you have to recognize your trauma, your triggers and stuff of when, things, and then work through that. But that's one of the things I advocate as a deaf advocate is parents and children have the right to family counseling to navigate just what some of these providers said. Okay, go on, Linda. Were you at a point?
It's not about what you're talking about. It's before you start back in the next segment, just give me a minute.
All right, so does anybody witness, so we take a break or what'd you say? So, all right, I apologize, I rely on lip reading a little bit, so if I don't see your lips, it's like, bye-bye. Okay, does anybody want to share a little bit? Or discuss? No, too. You do? Okay.
I have no shame.
She's like, oh no, I might want to take this away. it's Ashley again. I was gonna say, growing up, I had a severe learning disability. Like, just passed from grade to grade to grade. By the time I got to ninth grade, I only had a second grade math level and a second grade reading level. I was told by my high school counselor in ninth grade, just drop out of school. You're too stupid. You're never going to be anything, and go to McDonald's and become a hamburger flipper. And I said, no. I told her I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to be in the medical profession. That's my passion. She said, honey, give it up. And that's what a lot in my era, and I still see it today. I mean, even with my own son, with him going through IEPs, they were telling me at his former school, he's not teachable. I have an IEP goal plan that told me to just have him put in a clinic far away in another state, that he was not teachable, and that should not be happening. So that's where that neglect, severe gross negligence.
So let's turn the conversation. How, as advocates, whether disabled advocates and parent advocates, non-special education attorneys ourselves that work in the sector, how can we challenge this? Food for thought. So having conversations.
Increase awareness and share awareness of the situation. Share information. Thank you, Linda.
Wait for the mic and introduce yourself.
June Wilson, Huntsville, Alabama. I think that we just need to continue having the conversation. We have to continue being uncomfortable, and finding comfort in the discomfort as we are having those conversations, but just continuing to have the conversation to increase awareness.
Absolutely. One more, and then we'll.
Michelle.
Have till.
Oh,
okay.
I'm not gonna be 20 minutes. I'll be 15. I'll only take 15 minutes. No.
Just need to remember that.
I've got to, before you do that, real quick, everybody who had pecan crusted chicken, raise your hand for dinner. Okay, hold on. Really, literally. Like pecan, raise your hand, pecan crusted chicken. Okay, now we're gonna do who had. Okay, pay attention. Who had fish?
Oh, no. Wait a minute. I had the fish. I did the fish. I'm pescatarian. No, I'm pescatarian, so I'm trying to remember what did I.
No, y'all can't do fish and chicken. Okay, and then we had a vegetarian plate. I had some people with the vegetarian plate. Where are you? Okay, I've got a good start and I've got y'all dinner, so you can go and so they're going to come start bringing food in. You can talk as long as you want while they're bringing in the food.
No, it's.
Yeah, I just had a quick, but I'm cool. No. No, okay. I just wanted to chime in on Ashley's point as a special education advocate working with children from first grade through about 9th or 10th that I worked with. You see it in special education through what's called, well, basically through setting low expectations. And there are also districts who shall remain nameless, but are the largest district in the state, who consistently try to force parents to allow their children children who can't read on reading level or can't perform at their grade level math to allow them to fail, or to send them to what's called a center-based educational setting, which is basically another institution.
And that was Michelle. And that was almost 15 minutes. Just kidding.
All right, so we're gonna breeze through this part because they are giving y'all the PowerPoint, and y'all, there's a lot of words on the next couple slides because I really appreciate the United Nations Declaration. That's more of the emphasis at this point, just so you know. So part of the reawakening movement is that there's a massive grassroots with parents all across the world at this point, and they came together and created a statement of rights of what helped with eventually write a lot of our disability rights later. And this is the United Nations General Assembly Declaration on Rights of Disabled Persons. And this was adopted in December 9th, 1975. I want y'all to catch something. Section 504 passed in 73. So this was passed at the United Nations level after some of the major civil rights and disability rights things passed in America. So I do want to let people know in that time. I'll let you guys read through it later, but it's excellent. All right, now let's talk about people. John Bargery and Mr. Arthur Truder. It was a friendship that really helped a lot in terms of disability rights of parents. So John Bargery was a U.S. representative in Rhode Island, and he attended the Rhode Island Association for Retarded Children, which is basically the parent organization. And he was invited by Arthur Trudy. And he listened to the story of parents. So again, what you talked about, story sharing is powerful. We know this. Storytelling is the most powerful form of advocacy. I stand on that as a self-advocate. So he listened to stories of legislator about lack of services, denial of services, segregation, institution conditions. So 1955, as a health expert, because he was on the health expert, basically as a U.S. representative, he opened the annual subcommittee hearings on behalf of children with intellectual disabilities. And it was clear from these hearings that Bargery was raising the same concerns as other experts with children with disabilities. So this was pivotal because people in Congress started thinking about all the stuff. And this is where the fight for services started really in terms of medical model opposing this parent movement as both. So this is why I'm referring to medical model opposition. So institutions were still prevalent in the 1950s to 1980s because despite the advocacy of parents, because the medical model dominated institution care due to the perspective of disability needing medical treatment. And it goes back to the ancient philosophy of people with disability as children of God, because people with disability need compassionate care. Most of your physicians, I'm not saying all, but most of your physicians in general, they believe they're going to the health field to take care of people. Like most of us, we commit to healthcare because we believe we're helping people. So 1954 is the president of the American Association of Mental Deficiency was asked about what he thought about the whole parent stuff and whether or not people with disabilities should have a right to education. And his response was, medicine, not education, will be the answers. So parents started taking matters into their hands a bit more, started community programs within their homes and churches and community building. So this is where we start to see a little bit more parents trying to create programs and everything within their cities versus having to send their children to these institutes, because Arthur Hoppe was encouraging the medical community of these institutions, like medicine's still the answer, disability is meant to be cured. Like we don't need to be wasting time and funding on educating them. So, all right. And then despite progress on certain fronts, the medical model was prevalent in 1950s, 1970s. Doctors continued to recommend to parents to place their children with disability institutes to treat their disability. Between 1946 and 1967, the number of people of disabilities terms of, and this is doubling, not in institutions, this is doubling in the number of people born with a disability. So it doubles. So remember, we're still having these huge population booms and all this is the point. So it's important to know the stat. So people were still seen as a burden to the family. And Albert Jutsch's term that institutions were a place of neglect. And it was basically genocide in the form. So, all right. So here's what I want to show. This is the medical model in 1950s, 1970s, which I know Daniel will teach a bit more on tomorrow. I know you mentioned it a little bit because it relates to independent living, but here's what I want to share. This is the medical model This is my presentation this past January. From the American Academy of Pediatricians. They're trying to push for a medical home system, but they acknowledge that this is the medical model still, which I thought was really interesting. So, and this is related to deafness, but I thought it was really interesting that you're still seeing, and they've grouped in parents in the center of all this. So, all right, segregation within the medical model. So like we said, the medical model was still prevalent. Institutions were viewed now as places for observation and treatment of disabilities. So we went from people assessing or caring for people with disability where it was work labor thing to turning into if you were a professional, you had a white coat. So if you don't know what white coat syndrome means, look it up because a lot of it started with this as well, and it's real. So staff and professionals, white coats, lived in separate spaces, and these bigger institutes that got built by government funding that had their own bathroom, their own toilets and everything, while people who lived in these institutions across Black people, people of color, people with disabilities were living on floors and had one bathroom to share all, which is basically jail. And I'm going to find, like I mentioned earlier, there is a documentary on Netflix that talks about the history of institutions related to crime in jail, especially the segregation of Black people, and a lot of that history ties to this. So people with disabilities were just left these institutions because they were incurable. So we're going to talk about Willowbrook State Hospital. I do not have a whole lot of photos because it is triggering, but we do need to recognize this photo because I want to recognize the date on it. This photo is from 1966. These are children who were placed in here. And this is the same year that Congress passed the federal special education law, Education of the Handicap Act of 1966. And this is where children with disabilities were still at the Willowbrook State Hospital. Yeah. Willowbrook was pretty notorious for dehumanizing all people, children to adults, both. They always passed their health inspections because they had rooms with beds and stuff that were never touched. People were living on the floors, truly. And for every 6,000 residents, there were a few physicians. Triage was the priority, so basically ER. So if you were sick or something, you did get medical help because the priority was stopping the fights and everything. It was broken bones and blood were treated first. And I'm gonna say the words complete silence on the treatment of people at Willowbrook. This was in New York. The government knew about it. Parent advocacy groups knew about it. Medical professionals knew about it. Multiple people knew about it, but there was so much fear on whistleblowing because the amount of funding and the amount of politics that went into Willowbrook that people were scared to whistleblow on Willowbrook. And that's why Willowbrook got to operate as long as they did, with just the amount of dehumanization. And I'm sorry to say it, but when you look at the history of everything, it's not far from what Nazis did to some people in Germany, concentration camps. That's one. One of the things that was notorious, this is where they perform experiments on people with disabilities and people who were Black and people of color. It was a hepatitis experiment. They intentionally infected people with hepatitis. And the reasoning was like, well, they're going to infect it at some point, so they're stat at some point. So we'll just go ahead and infect them early and study them and see how hepatitis forms with no cure. And this happened at Willowbrook in New York. And the study started in 1956 and lasted 14 years. The whistleblowing was due to Robert Kennedy. So Senator Robert Kennedy, he wanted to go, he had heard rumors about how horrible it was, and he basically showed up with a film crew. And they walked through and he was able to capture it some, but the true whistleblowers, I would say, Willowbrook were Burt Blatt and Fred Kaplan. They visited as investigative journalism, and they had a hidden camera on that. And this was in 1966, so the same year. So that photo you have of the boys sitting on the bathroom stuff is from that. The same year that the Education of All Handicapped Children was passed was the same time they were trying to whistleblow on them. It led to a photographic essay known as Christmas in Purgatory. The essay was published in Look magazine, leading to a large reader response. And Dr. Blatt himself, who was one of the people that whistleblow, there is hell on earth, and in America, there is a special inferno, the institution. So I believe we've already discussed a little bit, but for the sake of timing, I think y'all will hit on this more because part of independent living, he is going to touch on institutions again. So if you have any interesting thoughts you want to share, please write them. I would love to hear them and stuff, but we're keep going just for timing today. Because we absolutely know institutions still have to stay in jails. Our criminal system is a form of institution. All right, President Johnson, people forget he's the vice president of Kennedy became president, but he's responsible. He basically wanted to carry out what Kennedy had started, he finished it. So his significant contribution with China and institutions is he helped pass some of the laws. He kept the presidential panel, and his agenda on civil rights and the war on poverty affected people with disabilities. He kept forward. So he launched the Equal Opportunity Act of 1966, which has a lot of programs, and y'all will touch on that tomorrow. He created the Presidential Committee on Mental Retardation, which so he continued what President Kennedy done. And he signed the Educational Act, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. I didn't mean to misspell that. All right. This is really cool to me. So the parent group started organizing national youth conferences from 1967 to 1968, and it led to the formation of the Youth NARC. And the purpose was to serve as a friend of mentally retarded persons to help the retarded learn to live and work in an attempt to better his world. And it was basically one of the first organizations where they encouraged youth members to join and had a manual with how to be friends with people with disability. And I loved it because in the manual for them related to working with adults with disability, the words are talk to him, listen to him, find out what he thinks, how he feels, what he wants to do, help him be a bigger part of the world, and encourage him to do everything he can for himself. And I want to touch a little bit on this advocacy movement, but they actually put in their manual kind of specifically, don't help the person, like be there to support the person, but don't help them unless they ask you for help. So it did start facilitating some of that independence as well. All right, normalization principle. We are going to talk on him tomorrow because it relates to self-advocacy movement too, but how much do you talk on normalization principle? No, so let's review it because it will help make sense for independent living and self-advocacy both. So the normalization principle was actually created by Niels Mikkelsen in Denmark and Sweden, because parent groups in Denmark were really petitioning and actually got the Denmark government to start accepting that people with disabilities deserve to have the opportunity to be normal, not in the sense of trying to treat them being normal, but they should have the opportunity, equal opportunities to live their lives to their best of their abilities and stuff. So from that, this is a speech he gave about the concept did not refer to making people normal to behave them a certain way, but rather to live according to a normal pattern. So they have the same opportunities that we do. And then Dr. Bennett Nurgel of the Swedish Parents Association for Mental Retarded Children developed the principle of normalization. Amon Frank Mikkelsen and Carl Gernwald from Denmark. And he presented this to the United Nations overall, and he had actually presented this in the 1969 President's Report on Mental Retardation in America. And this 7 principle of normalization actually helped create a lot of the Americans with Disabilities Acts and some of the aspects on it in terms of it drove a lot of the self-advocacy movement, which I thought was really cool. But when you look at these principles, it's just an everyday experience. And I love point 6, because so many people don't recognize disability because just people with disability are discouraged to marry. So I like principle 6, and that's what's related to split marriage. But they have the right to live, to work, and play in normal communities. They should not be segregated. And that was the idea of the normalization principle. So, all right. Dr. Wolf Winsberg is another person who helped also with perspective disabilities. And, well, not really. So, sorry, there was a lot of history when I did this. Okay. He expanded on normalization principle because it was too simple. So when you go back and look, it's very simple, but there's not a lot of elaborate examples. So he took the normalization principle and basically gave examples of how it looked for a disability. So he tried to debunk. So for example, and this is not an exhaustive list, people with disabilities who were viewed as meant society, the perception that people with disabilities are somewhat evil, represent a danger to themselves, society. This perception typically leads to a concern for and measure leading to the destruction, segregation, containment, control, and persecution of persons with developmental disabilities. So he was basically taking every perspective that was harmful for people with disabilities. He was trying to put the dots together for the rest of the world. This is how we're hurting these people. So that was his work with the normalization principle, and it made a pretty impact because he recognized it was not an exhaustive list, but he had challenged a lot of those notations. So, all right, grassroots. And this is the book my mom read to help with her grassroots movement. This book was written by Dennis Jarn. She basically wrote a manual on how to organize an effective parent advocacy group and move governments. So basically that was the focus in late 1960s and 1980s for parents, was the call for better, which parent groups basically join disabled advocates. And we're gonna see a lot of that bridging between the history of self-advocacy movement, independent living, and parent groups together. So be good, all right. All right, so one of the things I love about this manual is, let's see. Yeah, what about this manual? This was her statement to parents. What empowerment is that? Like, this was written in 1980. I love point 4, you must not accept these old excuses. There isn't enough money, we need more time. And I love that next one. You must stop whispering when everyone else is shouting. So, for people who are not familiar, I am actually a huge fan of Radical by Saul. Because if you look at a lot of how he talks about to mobilize and stuff for the Black community, Black Panthers vote, it is also excellent when you look at the history of disabilities too. So just interesting food for thought. All right. And then we have Plessy versus Ferguson, which happened in 1896. And the reason I like to go back to this is important because we have to think about where we were to where we're going. So with this, they did acknowledge that in the respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the pure, the most powerful. And this is just an opinion on that. So, oh, I have it twice, I'm sorry. So, okay, so that's where we're getting to civil rights and disability rights. So when I use the word parallel timelines, I was actually a little disappointed. If y'all have any references, I would love them, but I actually had a really hard time finding a source that show when civil rights history happened the same time as disability history. Like I just had to actually compare multiple resources, so I did the very best I could. But I think it's important for us to see like how boom, 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 everything is. So we're not gonna necessarily read everything word for word. I hope this is visible, but if not, you guys will have this copy. So we're gonna start more right around 1868, which is when the 14th Amendment to the Constitution happened that freed all slaves, especially people who are Black. But then again, it's like I say, I go back to that point. It freed people who were born or naturalized on United States. And provide all citizens with equal protection under laws. But then Plessy versus Ferguson happened, which is the whole case separate but equal, which is Jim Crow laws, and that's 1896. So even though they recognized civil rights stuff, they still didn't. So, and then we got recognized 1920s is when the eugenics movement started. And you can just kind of see what's happening here. It's a pretty dark period in terms of disability, even though we had a president, FDR, who had disability himself to extent. 1994 is when Brown versus Board of Education started desegregation of schools. In 1956 is when we had the bus boycott because of Rosa Parks' arrest in Montgomery, Alabama. So this is a lot of civil rights and stuff. And this whole time we know that institutionalization for disabilities and everybody else is happening during all this. All right, we get into 1957 and Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School integration led to a lot of violence because the governor of Arkansas called his own National Guard in to try to kick out the Black 9 students. And then the president at the time called the US troops to step in to protect these 9 Black students. And then we had the Freedom Riders that happened from Montgomery, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi in 1961. And there was not as many disability movements. And I'm gonna hit some of them on my presentation tomorrow because they're not on this slide and I should go back and add them. But what I wanted to highlight here is all the civil rights history we have with Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of the protests. And one of the things that I'm going to hit on tomorrow in 1965, one of the biggest disability activists, I'm blanking on his name right now. I will reference him tomorrow. He walked with Martin Luther King Jr. on something. Thank you. Yep. So there's people who have disabilities who were supporting the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement helps people with disabilities as well. But I want to show this whole timeline because, as you see, 1964, Civil Rights Acts passed, but it was not until 1988 that people with disabilities were included. They did not include people with disabilities at this point and when they passed this act. I put in 1966, the Black Panthers were found. And it's super important because tomorrow we'll also talk about one of the biggest Black and disabled activist himself, Brad Lomax, tomorrow, because he's the founder of the Washington DC Black Panthers chapter, and he ends up being a huge mover and shaker for the rest of the disability movements tomorrow. So then look at this, starting in 1967, look at how many acts we have on it. And this is not an exhaustive list, but you get the idea with when you look back at the last slide, we have the civil rights, and then we have the push into disability acts as well. So like I said, this is not an exhaustive list, but I like this because it kind of gives you a visual of how much was overlapping at the same time at this point too. So, all right. And then we get into 1978, into the 80s, and I could have kept going, but for the sake of everything, this is kind of where I summarized that. Yes, you're laughing. But this is really important because this is between the time that the Civil Rights Act passed, which was 1964, all the way to 1988, is what included people with disabilities at that point. And we have a lot of acts between that helped a lot, but we'll discuss tomorrow. One of the big things that I like to point out that people don't realize, there was an attempt to weaken Section 504 and special education both under the Reagan administration. And that's really interesting history because some of the biggest disability activists were friends of Ronald Reagan, President Reagan. And it's really interesting reading all about that. But he ended up listening ultimately. So, all right. And then 90s, 1990. This is just 1 year alone. And that's where I finished it because you can see how much was happening. So I did put in some pretty big events. One of the big events being the Capitol Crawl of 1990, which was in Washington, D.C. But there's some events before that event, and it refers back to some of the names we just mentioned. So it's really cool. And of course, 1990 is when the Americans with Disability Act was passed under President George H.W. Bush. So just give you an idea, the merging. All right. Litigation legislation. This is not me speaking as attorney. This is just educational information, just pointing out some impactful, just very impactful litigation and legislation. We're hit legislation first. So we hit some legislation, some will be covered tomorrow. But what's important about this legislation right here, it ultimately led to the Development Disabilities Act of 1957, which ultimately helps give us where we are in terms of councils today. And Daryl Powell spoke on this in the past. Have y'all talked about the history of the National Council of Development Disabilities yet or not? I don't know. No, okay. But this is one of the acts that help fuel and provide the means for us to be able to have the Alabama Council of Development Disabilities today in the National Council. So it's very, well, go ahead.
I think in tough years, I think it's kind of be kind of somewhere.
Okay.
Your stuff is kind of tough on the route.
Yeah, we can do that. Darryl will certainly want you to be part of that discussion.
So, all right. And then what was really important about this act is the term development disability was created to refer to a disability that attributed to mental retardation, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and or other neurological conditions. And it was used for plan purposes of funding. And I think it's really important because in 1975, it included autism and dyslexia as well. So the history of this act, if you go back and read, it's actually pretty powerful and it's significant because when you look at how much it included and was advocating for a lot of other disabilities too. So, all right. And the 1991 amendment, I like this one because it include and put an age number on it. Because at one point it really didn't have a lot, but they put an age on it. We're including children ages 5 and up who have a severe chronic disability. With this list, and it expands because this is not just one slide. And really looked at the functional limitations in the major life activities, which is so important because when you look at 504 especially and IDA both, there's a bit of separation there because people realize the IDA has its own impairment labels, but DD Act helps support me a lot of what you look at Americans with Disability in Section 504 in terms of living major functions. So, are we following? Yeah. All right, and then other acts prior to 1970s that were really notable. This is just a list. I'll let you guys read through this a little bit later, but if you want to see what lists of what our acts were passed that I didn't get to add to that civil rights and disability timeline, this is some of them. All right, and then I thought it was really interesting. I highlight 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was one of the first acts before. Yes, because 1966 is when the Education for All Handicapped Children was passed. So this is like the act before that act too. So that's why I like to highlight this one. And the focus was they didn't necessarily use the word disability, but they told that the states and local educational agencies had to educate children that are educationally deprived. So I thought it was interesting. All right. And then this is some of the DD acts, Social Security, the Rehab Act, which we refer as Section 504, but I like to highlight that Section 501 and 503 protect people with disabilities from employment discrimination by federal agencies or federal contractors. So that's important to know. We have the Housing Community Development Act, and we have the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is later renamed to ID in 1990. I like to highlight this because in 1990, they started covering a bit more earlier intervention. So, all right, we have all the amendments. I also like the golden round one. So what I mean by 1975, there's a lot of golden acts that help fuel and protect the history of disability rights in history. So especially the 1993 amendment, I love this line. It recognizes, it's written in, disability is a natural part of the human experience that does not diminish the right of individuals with developed disabilities to enjoy the opportunity to live independently, enjoy self-determination, which it's so important for self-advocacy, and we're gonna talk about that tomorrow. Make choices, contribute to society, experience full integration and inclusion in the economic, political, social, cultural, and education mainstream of American society. That's Section 101 Amendment of 1993. All right, and then we have some more amendments to the Rehab Act, which will be important to understand because the history of the Section 504 SIP, because it passed, people were not actually using Section 504. So the Rehab Act is also Section 504 in that class. So they changed, and the definition of severe handicap was amended to include functional and category criteria both. And definition of employee was added, so it opened more opportunities for people too. And then we have the Employment Opportunities for Disabled Americans Act. As you see, we have a lot of acts. We have the reauthorization of the Education and Handicapped Children Act prior to ID. And then technology-related assistant. I look back, it has not been updated. There's actually been a lot of talk in the deaf community that we need some big acts updated related to assistive technology, especially closed captioning and different stuff as well. So that's been interesting because it's not just us deaf people that benefit from it, but other people too. So, and then the picture. So going round two, which is in the 1990s, as we know, the law will pass, but this is a famous picture of President George H.W. Bush signing it. And the guy in the hat is Justin Dart, who is a significant disabled activist as well. So we'll talk a little bit on that tomorrow too, but big legislation. And then we have ID. And this is one of the things that I also appreciate about ID when it was created or reauthorized / transition ID in 1990. It included a system of transition services for students ages 14 over older, because at that point, there was no transition plan yet in the original Education Act. So that's really important because part of living with disability is knowing how to learn and integrate into life as the ability to be able to make our own choices as an adult. And that's a huge part of planning this transition service. So, all right. Court cases, we talked about Brown, because we know that separate facilities are inherent unequal. And this was actually beneficial for disability because we remember institution and special education classrooms. Parents were trying to fight to give their children the opportunity to mainstream. So that's the thing I like to hit here. All right. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let you guys read this because these are a couple of legislation that's really important. This one's actually really cool because Dr. Gilbert consulted Pennsylvania and had noted that the parent group had exhausted all admin and legislative remedies. And at first, the parent group was not going to take action against the state, and they decided to take action against the state. So this one is a really cool case to read on later. The one that I want to highlight on, I love this as an advocate because some of the things I face as an advocate is parents are afraid to go to due process where I'm at. We're a pretty wealthy district and I think they're afraid of retaliation from the school district, basically. And I like this case a lot because They were afraid of retaliation, basically from the school districts and state both. So I love this case, so it's a big win for parent groups. So read it up later. That's how I feel about it. I love it. All right. Something I found interesting with all this. I'm gonna read this headline. This was a headline from May 8th of last year. Why don't you just read the number of complaints it got? I say one of the most powerful tools at advocate is the right to file an OCR complaint if you're just willing. I understand there's a lot of process to that and there's ways to do it, and I highly recommend you work with an attorney when you do it, but it's a powerful tool, and it's a tool that I find a lot of parent advocates do, is file an OCR complaint. So I thought it was just fascinating. But what was interesting, from the state pool from OSEP, that disability discrimination complaints continue to remain in the top 3 type of complaints in over like 20-year span. So, all right. And of course, we have some other cases, but I'm going to hit on another one that I find some people know, but some people don't. This is all history. Let's see. We're gonna keep going because of time. All right. I really hope y'all know what this means. Raise your hand if you do not. Chevy versus Cadillac. Which is referred to what? Yeah, I love early. Yeah. So definitely bring on this case. I just love it because the implications have for ID as well. I like to state it, but it's kind of true. I find a lot of educational cases come from discrimination and lack of provision of services to the person's language, in this case, to a deaf person. Because we're keep going. Let's see, Edward. So early happened to Edward. Does anybody know who Perez versus public schools is right now? Yeah, I know I posted this a couple times because I talked about HIPAA last year, but I say this is a new case that people should be watching at. Reading the amicus briefs have been really interesting because some people are a little hesitant to how pushy we could be post-case related to can we truly push the ADA compensation piece or not? But this quote right here is pulled from some of the amicus briefs. So it'll be really interesting to watch as an advocate and work alongside attorneys just to how much will this case start holding precedent. Because for a while, you cannot sue as a parent or as a person with disability under ID and ADA. And Mr. Perez did that. And the lower courts told him he had exhausted. And since he got his compensation from ID, he could get his compensation from ADA. And Supreme Court overruled it unanimously. So I think it'll be very interesting to see. I would love to get feedback from attorneys later, see what y'all think of this, because it's gonna be interesting to see. So that concludes all that. So thank you for your time. My voice is higher, as you can tell.
That's a lot of information. A lot of good information, really, it is. And it lets us know, and it's a lot of key takeaways from this, you know, and one of the things, just to make a long story short, we've come a long ways, but we got a long ways to go. And we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it because with people like you, hey, we're gonna make some positive change. So at this time, I'm gonna give it to Linda. Oh, okay. All right. Ms. Teagan?
I don't have audio for her.
No audio?
Okay, was it me?
Yeah,
Did
we
I do
can hear
that?
you. All right.
Hey.
Hey.
Daddy? No, that is not it.
I got one question for you. Are you still awake?
Oh, very much so. Yes. And you can see the people I'm trying to kick out.
All right.
Go. Very much so. Yes. I'm sorry. Kids. Go. Y'all just came in here as soon as I opened the camera. So this is why I'm not there right now. I had very sudden childcare issues. So
Join the crowd.
yeah.
Well, we're glad you were online. So if you have any questions for Ms. Jess, Mr. Dan, then let us know, or the group.
Thank you guys. Well, I had made a couple of comments along the way, which I know that I think his name is Adam. Red. So
Alex?
no, this was Alex. I'm sorry, Alex. Sorry. I knew it was an A. I apologize. But no, this has been phenomenal. I wish that I was with you guys in person. So I missed that. I was excited about that aspect of being able to be there in person. But next time. So no, this
We're gonna hold you to that
absolutely
now.
wonderful.
We're gonna hold you to it.
Amen. Look, y'all help me find somebody that's working. I had some people locked down and they've disappeared on me. So yes, no, this has been absolutely wonderful. I'm like super excited about tomorrow. I'm gonna try to find the video on Netflix that y'all are watching later so I can watch it too. Hold on, listen. I had to put on the mom voice. I'm like, I am incredibly excited. There were a few things that I learned. I know I like to research things often, so there were some things that were shared that I was like, oh yeah, I know that, I remember that. But there were definitely some aspects that I wasn't aware of. So this has been wonderfully enlightening. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being a good sport since we put you on the spot like that. She was not prepared to speak.
Oh, well, and look, I do want to add, and I know we've got to go because it's like past the time, but I did want to say, so my journey to this has been interesting. So at every level, and I know everybody here kind of shared their stories last Friday in the class, but at every level, you have to continue to advocate for yourself and your children. And so I'm so excited about this opportunity because it gives you more tools to be able to do that advocacy and maybe even do it on larger levels as well. So this has just been really wonderful. So I appreciate it. And nice to meet you.
So I graduated last year from PIPA, and you guys are gonna make some great friendships. We still have our group going, even though I haven't seen a lot anymore. It's been really fun to watch and be able to support each other's advocacy journeys. And we found we all just got good ideas from each other too. And that's really the heart of advocacy is you're in the trenches and you gotta have some people to lean on. It takes a village, it really does. And it shouldn't be done alone, but it can feel very isolating for so long. So it's exciting to see this continue to grow. So yeah.
Thank you, Tegan. We'll take you off the spotlight now. But now everyone knows what happens when you miss. You're gonna get put on the spot. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not really kidding.
Okay, so the food is going to be ready in a few minutes and they're going to come and bring it to the diagram that I shared with them from when you raised your hands. Just hope it's the right thing. Hope it's the right food you have. If not, talk to your neighbor. So you did get drink tickets. There is a little food out there. You can go out there for a few minutes. Your food will be back in here in a few minutes. They were scheduled to bring it at 6:30, but I said, bring it when it's hot. So it will be here by 6:30. And if not, so y'all just go out, come back in. And Alex isn't going to stay. Brooke and I are going to be producing on the movie tonight. We're production. So we think we have everything set up. So we'll just start it whenever we're ready and it will be in this room. So y'all have a little free time and then y'all come on back to eat.